And a warm welcome to everyone. You are watching CNN. I'm Paula Newton in New York, and we begin, of course, with the latest on the war in Ukraine and high-stakes diplomacy underway in Moscow at this hour. Russian President Vladimir Putin preparing to meet the UN Secretary General, who says he comes to Moscow as a messenger of peace. Now, after face-to-face talks with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Antonio Guterres again called for an immediate suspension of hostilities.
But it is my deep conviction that the sooner we end this war, the better, for the people of Ukraine, for the people of the Russian Federation, and those far beyond. The United Nations has repeatedly called for ceasefires to protect civilians and to facilitate a political dialogue to reach a solution. So far, that has not been possible. Today, across the Donbass, a violent battle is underway with tremendous death and destruction.
Now, for his part, Lavrov accused Ukraine of being uninterested in serious negotiations, adding that if that continues, talks are not likely to be productive. And so the fighting goes on. The Ukrainian nuclear energy company now says 2 cruise missiles flew over the Zaporizhzhia power plant at low altitude. Goes without saying, it's very dangerous. Later, authorities said 2 guided missiles were fired into the city. A 3rd missile exploded in the air, and 1 person was killed. In Luhansk, meantime, new drone video shows the village of Novotoshkivka completely destroyed by recent fighting. I mean, look at those images, barely anything standing. And after weeks of occupying Kherson, Russian troops have taken control of the city council there. The mayor says armed men took the keys and replaced Ukrainian guards with their own. And now to the mayor of Mariupol, who says a 3rd mass grave has been found near the city. Now, he says Russians made locals work for hours on those graves in exchange for food and water. We have been unable to verify those latest claims, and a short time ago, the UN Secretary General called for an investigation into claims of those war crimes.
I'm concerned about the repeated reports of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law and possible war crimes, and they require independent investigation for effective accountability.
CNN correspondent Scott McLean is in Lviv for us, and he's been following all the latest developments. We just heard those allegations, profoundly disturbing, right, Scott? I mean, a situation where you're digging graves of the residents there for food and water. What more do we know?
Hey, Paula, yeah, not the first accusation of mass graves in and around Mariupol, but certainly the most disturbing of the allegations we've heard thus far. So the allegation being made by the Mariupol City Council is that these mass graves, as they say, are just in a village just to the north of the Mariupol city limits. They say that satellite images show that at the end of March, you could see the graves beginning to be dug. Then later, in early April, they were partially filled over and then expanded. And then in late April, not long ago, they had reached some 200 meters long collectively. As you mentioned, CNN can't verify that this is in fact a mass grave, but the most disturbing accusation is that people were essentially working to dig those graves, local people working to dig those graves in exchange for food and for water. 2 other accusations had been made previously about mass graves in villages to the east and to the west of Mariupol. Again, CNN can't confirm those either. The situation in Mariupol is obviously desperate. It has been that way for some time. People have been trying to find any way that they can to get out of the city, but many of those people, we know, Paula, have been pushed toward Russian territory. Just on Saturday, the Ukrainians accused Russia of tricking some 200 people into evacuating Mariupol into Russian-held territory when they believed they were going to go in the opposite direction. And then late last week, there were a group of people, more than 300 of them, who showed up in Siberia from Mariupol. That in particular is bringing up some memories, some painful memories of Soviet-era forced relocations where people were political dissidents, all kinds of people were essentially uprooted from their homes and forcibly sent to sparsely populated parts of the Soviet Union. And I spoke with one survivor of those forced deportations or forced relocations from Estonia, who was taken from his home in Estonia, then part of the Soviet Union, to Siberia as a child. And he said he sees plenty of parallels between his story and what's happening in Ukraine today. Listen. What's been the lasting impact of this experience on your life?
I lost my childhood. I had to remain myself in a foreign and hostile environment.
Do you see any parallels with what's happening today?
I was sure that nothing like this could ever happen again. But what has happened in Ukraine has brought these painful memories back very vividly. It's unbelievable that time hasn't changed anything at all. Evil has become even worse. With my whole soul, I feel for Ukrainians who are taken violently, against their will, from their homes to the unknown.
Now, Paula, it's not clear how many people have been pushed into Russian territory. I've met some people who've had that experience and then managed to make it back into Europe. But the threat of being pushed in that direction is undoubtedly hampering efforts to evacuate people. You'll remember just yesterday, the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine rejected a Russian ceasefire proposal to get people out of that sprawling steel plant because she said the Russians simply could not be trusted to keep their word. If there is any glimmer of hope, it's that the UN Secretary General said that he would like to see a situation where representatives from the United Nations and the Red Cross on the ground could help facilitate humanitarian corridors to get people out of Mariupol. Paula?
Yeah, it is so heartbreaking that day after day we talk about Mariupol and still nothing being done to get any humanitarian help there. Scott McLean, appreciate the latest update. And as we have been saying, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is in Moscow at this hour meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Here's the latest.
According to the Russian Federation, what is taking place is a special military operation with the objectives that were announced. According to the UN, in line with the resolutions passed by the General Assembly, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a violation of its territorial integrity and against the Charter of the United Nations.
Guterres, we should note, is also scheduled to meet, of course, with Vladimir Putin in the next hour. We will bring you the latest on that to bring us up to date on what's gone on in Moscow so far. Nick Robertson now joins us with more details. Nick, the Secretary General said in this visit that he is looking to, in his words, lay the groundwork for dialogue. But, I was just saying those humanitarian concerns remain in Mariupol. And yet, the Secretary General being criticized for what is essentially unfolding, right? Ukrainian officials said, we do not expect anything to come of this. And given what Lavrov just said in the press conference, they may be right.
There's so much that's been said that tells you so much about what is going to happen. The reality for Mariupol, it's not in Russia's strategic interest to cede any element of what's happening there. We've heard President Putin in the past say seal it off so that not even a gnat, not even a fly can get in there. Why? Quite simply, it's not in Russia's strategic interests because to have any humanitarian effort there and to open a corridor that might just allow the Ukrainian forces to hold on and keep some territory there, this would be the Russian perspective, would be counter to what Russia's trying to achieve, which is to take control utterly of Mariupol and the sea all the way in this sort of land bridge to Crimea. What did we hear at the meeting today? We heard Sergei Lavrov saying that Guterres was coming at a very hard time. In the Kremlin parlance, this essentially is Moscow saying, this is a hard time. There are problems coming out of Ukraine. It's almost as if the Kremlin doesn't feel that they have a responsibility for the war, for the situation. Guterres is walking into a very tough diplomatic place. And as you said, President Zelensky in Ukraine criticized him for going to Moscow first, because what President Zelensky said was, look, come to Ukraine, come and go to Bucha, come and look at the places where war crimes have been committed, come see the evidence, take that into these detailed meetings that you're having in Moscow. Remembering, of course, that the Austrian Chancellor took his meetings in that order. We know that others have done the same as well, that they've gone to see what's happening in Ukraine, and then they've had their telephone conversations with President Putin, other European leaders. Charles Michel, the most recent European Council president, went to Kyiv, had a phone call a couple of days later with President Putin. They've all sort of taken on board that evidence, and that's of war crimes, and that's really the thrust of what President Zelensky was criticizing Guterres of. But, you know, everyone has an interest here in peace, and the humanitarian situation in Mariupol is at the priority and forefront of that at the moment. But to get to your original point, I think expectations of the reality of any type of peace anytime soon are utterly unrealistic, because there are still military advantages to be tested and tried for on the ground. Russia to gain more ground, Ukraine to hold them back and even push Russia back. We're not near yet, it seems, a realistic path to peace.
Yeah, to say the least. As we said, we'll continue to bring you more news in the next hour as Guterres meets with Vladimir Putin. In the meantime, Nick Robertson, thank you. Appreciate that update. We want to take a look now on those stock markets and how they're doing around the world. Yes, more headlines from Asia. The Shanghai market closed lower for a second day in a row, falling 1.4%. Of course, there are the concerns about the growing impact of continuing COVID-19 lockdowns on China's economy. We will have a live report from China for you coming up. Meantime, European markets are trading higher, as you can see there. In the U.S., though, futures pointing to a lower open on Wall Street. Morgan Stanley is warning its clients of a potential bear market, saying investors have very few places to hide right now. I will add they will probably hide in the safe haven of higher interest rates, so continue to watch the markets there. Meantime, the world's richest man is about to be in charge of one of the most influential social media companies in the world. So what does Elon Musk's multi-billion-dollar deal mean for its users and its employees? Rahel Solomon has been following this since the news broke. Rahel, you know, he's got it now, so what's he going to do with it?
Hi, Paula. Yeah, good to be with you. So we have a few hints from Elon Musk himself. New features, that's likely. Perhaps a subscription model. He has said that he wants to authenticate humans, ban the bots. We spoke about this yesterday, Paula. Also, he will have to figure out how to monetize Twitter. He has said that his bid wasn't exactly a way to make money off of Twitter, but we know that he has $21 billion of his own wealth on the line, in addition to that financing from Wall Street heavyweights. So how to get that money back to those lenders and, of course, make his own money back will be important. And freer speech. This is sort of the lightning rod of this story, of this conversation. You know, Twitter has been called before a very divisive and toxic platform, and they've sort of enacted certain measures to make that less so and to encourage healthy discourse. And so what does freer speech mean? And that's really the question, I think, that a lot of people are wrestling with, Paula.
Yeah, and a lot of free speech groups here in the United States falling on one side, the Anti-Defamation League here as well, also saying that this may be a dangerous development if he wants a freer public square. Rahel, there has been a lot of reaction, though, not just to the deal, but what it might mean going forward.
Yeah, and just to your point, even the ACLU weighing in, of course, a huge proponent of free speech, tweeting, we should be worried about any powerful central actor, whether it's a government or any wealthy individual, even if it is an ACLU member, having so much control over the boundaries of our political speech online. Also, fellow billionaire and also owner of the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, weighing in, tweeting yesterday, interesting question. Did the Chinese government just gain a bit of leverage over the town square? Of course, a reference to Tesla's Shanghai factory and Elon Musk's relationship with Chinese officials, and a reference to an Elon Musk tweet about Twitter becoming a digital town square. So lots of questions, lots of concerns, but we do know he also has one very influential supporter in his corner. That would be Jack Dorsey, co-founder of Twitter and former CEO, pointing out and tweeting in part, "I trust his mission to extend the light of consciousness." That's pretty tall order there, the light of consciousness, Paula.
Yeah, Rahel, it almost like, I don't know if that was a yoga term or a term to describe Twitter and what's going on right now, but obviously interesting hours and days ahead. Appreciate you staying on top of it. Now, we want to go to the stories making headlines now around the world. Beijing is scrambling to contain its latest COVID-19 outbreak. The city reported around 24 local cases over the last 24 hours. I know what you're thinking, it's not a lot, but officials are conducting repeat COVID tests on millions of people and imposing new lockdowns and restrictions. David Culver in Shanghai, which for weeks has been under one of the strictest lockdowns that China has ever imposed. David, you are also under that lockdown. Is there any clear indication at this point of China's strategy, right? Because you have been telling us for so long about the problems with food, medicine, healthcare when you're in lockdown, but now there is the specter of Beijing and other cities and towns that may be under these lockdowns in the days to come.
That is the most frustrating aspect of all of this, Paula, is the question of what's the end game? Where are we going with this? Because we have seen so many different policies rolled out here, and in Shanghai, admittedly, it has been mismanaged. There's been chaos. It's something that has really had an impact on most every resident living here in this city of more than 25 million people. And so if that's been lingering now for well over a month, because officially, yeah, the hard lockdown started April 1st for the entire city, but before that, for several weeks, many of us were in rolling lockdowns and had a lot of restrictions. And so we thought that was going to be the worst of it. Then came the hard lockdown. Now there's indications of a timeline and a roadmap to get out, but the timeline isn't specific. There's not a lot of details. And so people are really in this place of uncertainty. And I think that is creating more and more anxiety here as well. If you look at Beijing, too, you have to wonder, how are they going to approach this in the capital city? Perhaps they're going to scramble and they're going to do a similar citywide lockdown. Perhaps they're going to eventually expand it so that they're continuously testing people day after day. We've had relentless PCR tests here to the point where most have lost count. And so if they go that strategy, of course, Beijing will see the same problems with the zero COVID policy that is endorsed by President Xi Jinping. However, if they are able to control it, at least through the official narrative, and they're not going to the extent of a citywide lockdown, and if they are able to keep food supplies strong and keep people with the basic necessities, then they'll likely use that as the prime example of what Shanghai should have done, Paula. So they'll again push that on to the local officials for having messed up this situation.
Yeah, and we'll have to leave it there for now, but suffice it to say, Herculean efforts there to try and make this lockdown a little bit more bearable and also to keep the economy going. David Culver for us in Shanghai. Appreciate it. Now, North Korea's leader has pledged to strengthen his country's nuclear force at the highest possible speed. Kim Jong-un made the remarks at a military parade where some of Pyongyang's most powerful weapons were on display. South Korea says it is monitoring the activities of the North and is calling for peace and diplomacy. Okay, coming up for us, a policy reversal. Germany saying it will send anti-aircraft tanks to Ukraine. The latest on NATO's efforts to bolster military support next. Plus, we'll have much more on Musk's Twitter takeover. Could the platform become a subscription service under the world's richest man? We'll discuss. Welcome back. Germany is announcing it will deliver anti-aircraft tanks to Ukraine. The U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is at this hour holding a meeting with defense officials from about 40 nations to expand military support for Ukraine. Listen.
My Ukrainian friends, we know the burden that you all carry. And we know, and you should know, that all of us have your back. And that's why we're here today, to strengthen the arsenal of Ukrainian democracy.
Joining us now, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Alder. He's also president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And really good to have you in here with the new headlines. We're going to go straight to those headlines with Lavrov saying this is in fact a proxy war with NATO. And he, again, it won't surprise you, brought up the nuclear issue and saying, look, we are very close to this escalating and perhaps becoming a nuclear conflict. How do you see his comments?
Well, you know, none of this would be even happening unless Russia invaded Ukraine. And that is the fundamental problem that I think we're seeing happening over as a result. So if there is a war or a proxy war, it's because Russia invaded Ukraine. If there is escalation, it is because Russia decides to escalate. Had Russia not invaded, we wouldn't be where we are. And the result is that if we listen to Mr. Lavrov or Mr. Putin, they would be able to occupy all of Ukraine and have designs on further expansion. That's why it's important for us to stand up with the Ukrainians, to provide them with the means to defend themselves in Ukraine before this gets any further out of hand because of the designs that Russia has, not only on Ukraine, but frankly on the rest of Europe as well.
Do you think the resolve of the West is pivoting here? Do you think we're seeing a different stage of this in terms of how far they are willing to go to arm and help Ukraine?
Yeah, I think things are changing. We already saw in terms of the escalating on sanctions over the last few weeks, a coming together of Europe and the United States and our allies in the West, it really in disgust of what the Russians have been doing. The kind of pictures we saw coming out of Bucha, the unrelenting bombing of civilian targets, particularly in Mariupol, but everywhere else, really has stiffened the spine of the West. And then, of course, the Ukrainians have demonstrated a remarkable capability of defending themselves and even defeating Russian advances around Kyiv and other places. And so there's now this belief that if we can provide the Ukrainians with sufficient means, with the kind of heavy weapons that are being talked about today in Germany at the meeting that you just mentioned that Secretary Austin has convened, that in fact, not only can we help Ukraine stop the Russian advance, but actually push them back. And there is this sense now that there is an opportunity not just to reestablish sovereignty and independence of Ukraine, but weakening Russia for the long term, so it will never again be in a position to do what it did on February 24 and invade a country that posed absolutely no threat to Russia.
I know that's the goal, but I'm wondering how realistic that is. I mean, as you've been speaking, we've been showing pictures of the devastation in Ukraine. Ukraine, as you know, bearing a huge cost for this. And yet you write that, look, NATO should go further, not only including countries perhaps like Finland and Sweden, but also allowing Ukraine in. Some argue that's far too provocative and that we need a more imaginative security architecture that perhaps won't provoke Russia as much. I take your point that this is on Russia, and yet we seem to have very little leverage to change things on the ground right now in Ukraine.
Well, the leverage we have is sending the weapons that we are sending, and that is making a tremendous difference on the situation on the ground. Russia clearly has not succeeded in its initial goal, which was to overthrow the Ukrainian government and basically control what was happening in Ukraine. It has now scaled back its immediate ambitions to the east, where, in fact, it has been fighting the Ukrainians for the past eight years. And I think the lesson we now learned is that countries that are part of NATO are likely to be far more secure than countries are not. It's a lesson that the people in Finland and Sweden have come to a conclusion. Sweden has been a neutral and independent country for over 200 years, and now we see that they think that the Russian threat is such that they can only be secure to be part of NATO. If the Russian threat were to disappear, if Vladimir Putin were no longer in power, if his regime were no longer controlling what is happening in Russia, then of course you want a new security system, one that embraces Russia and the Russian people and makes sure that we are all secure by living peacefully together. But we can't get there if we allow Vladimir Putin to succeed in Ukraine, because if he succeeds there, his ambitions will go far beyond.
You know, many have commented that this is just going to embolden other rogue nations around the world, especially down that very dangerous nuclear path. Is this not the message to them, though? I mean, Vladimir Putin is at this hour receiving the Secretary General and likely saying, we refuse to budge. Basically, they are holding all the cards right now.
Well, they're holding a lot of cards, but they're also lost a lot of them. Remember that the initial phase of this operation was going to last for just a few days, that the government in Ukraine would have fallen, that a new puppet regime would have been installed, that Russia would have occupied and put under its control not just the capital, but also all the major cities in Ukraine, including Odessa, that the West was supposed to shiver and stand in division rather than being united, and that Russia really would get away with it. Well, where is he now? He's lost the initial stages of the battle. He is no longer going to be able to control Ukraine. The government is stronger and more united and in control of Kyiv and launching counteroffensives around the country. He has found that NATO has become stronger and more capable, putting forces closer to Moscow, and indeed Finland and Sweden deciding to join NATO. And he's facing a much more united Europe and a much more united alliance that is now also imposing very severe economic sanctions that are going to hurt the Russian economy for decades unless something drastic changes. So if anybody looks at this and says Vladimir Putin is getting away with a lot, I think what they're seeing is a very strong reaction and a miscalculation on Vladimir Putin's part that they will take to heart, and they won't necessarily do the provocative things elsewhere because of fear of what the United States, its allies around the world can do in response.
Well, we'll see if it does work as a deterrent. It is not so far in Ukraine, unfortunately. Ambassador, thank you for weighing in on this. Appreciate it. Now, stay with us here on First Move. We have the latest details on Russia's war on Ukraine right after this. And welcome back, everyone. We want to bring you right up to date on our latest on our top story. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is warning of a considerable risk of nuclear conflict as war in Ukraine continues. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is in Moscow at this hour, meeting with Lavrov and his boss, President Vladimir Putin. The UN chief will also speak with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv later this week. Meantime, further horror in Ukraine as this war just goes on. The mayor of Mariupol saying a third mass grave has been found near the city. The demands on healthcare workers, meantime, have increased exponentially since the beginning of this invasion. Many are putting their lives at risk every day to save others. CNN's Clarissa Ward and her team followed two brave paramedics as they attempt to save a wounded man during heavy Russian shelling.
It's the beginning of a 24-hour shift for paramedics Alexandra Russko-ukrainskaya and Vladimir Wenzel. They prepare their ambulance for the carnage that Kharkiv residents confront every day. We have two tourniquets, Vladimir says. Alexandra's mother stops by the dispatch center to give her daughter a hug. This is one of the most dangerous jobs. Every moment together is precious. A loud stream of boom signals the day's work is beginning. That's incoming now, this ambulance worker tells us. Alexandra and Vladimir answer the call. Temperatura, she says, the code used when someone has been wounded by shelling. Their flak jackets on, they're ready to roll out.
So they've said that they've got reports one person at least has been injured in the shelling, and they're hearing some rockets as well, so we're going to see what's going on.
The shells hit a residential apartment building. The paramedics need to act fast. Russian forces are increasingly hitting the same target twice. It's called a double tap. A horrifying strategy to take out rescue workers as they respond. As we see for ourselves. Get in, Vladimir shouts. Faster, faster, faster. We take cover under the stairwell. Alexandra is trying to find the wounded person, but there's no signal. At that moment, another barrage goes off. We brace for the impact.
All right, bye for now, yeah?
Is everybody okay? Alexandra asks. Our team member, Maria Avdeeva, has cut up her hands on broken glass. Vladimir treats her injuries, as Alexandra calls the dispatch again to find where the wounded are. We've got no connection. We're sitting in the entrance, she says, and they're shelling the shit out of us. The connection keeps dropping. Finally, she gets through to the person who called for the ambulance. Tell me your damn house number, she says. I repeat, 12G. I've told you 1,000 times, he replies. The man is dying. We decide to try to make a run for it.
1, 2, 3, let's go. Go. Come on, Maria. Maria, come on. Come on, Maria. Come on. Go, go. Get in the car. In the car. Slide over, slide over. The ambulance was hit, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so we were just in an apartment building. They were looking for an injured man. A bunch of rounds came in and hit the next door building, so now we are getting out as fast as we can.
While we run out, Vladimir and Alexandra run back in. We find them treating the injured man on the side of the road. Their back window has been blown out by the blasts. He has shrapnel injuries and head trauma. Once they've stabilized him, they rush him to the hospital. Vladimir asks about his pain. The man has been deafened by the blast. Arriving at the hospital, they've done their part. It's up to others now to save him.
I have to say, I think you guys are like the bravest people I have ever met.
Back at base, we asked them why they continue to do this work, with all the danger it entails. It's normal. This is our work. Of course it's scary, like for everyone, Alexandra says. Today you were with us in the hottest place, in the oven, but we're still alive, thank God. You feel it's your duty or obligation, Vladimir tells us, to help the people who are still here.
And what do your parents say? What does your family say? Aren't they wanting you to stop this work?
No comments. No comments. It's very difficult.
They must be scared.
Yes.
Proud, but scared.
Call all day, all night.
We saw your mother.
Yes.
Ваша мама сегодня.
Да, приходила.
Она волнуется.
Очень волнуется.
She's worried to the point of hysteria, Alexandra tells us. She says you need to leave. You need to go to some safe place. Why are you doing this? I have only one child. Stop it.
And what do you say?
Я должна.
I have to do it, she says simply. And with that, they go back to cleaning their ambulance. Their shift only halfway through. Clarissa Ward, CNN, Kharkiv.
And we thank Clarissa and her team for that incredible report. Coming up for us here on First Move, the fate of Ukraine's animals and the pets fleeing the war with their owners. So a bleak reminder here, according to the UN, more than 5 million Ukrainians have fled the Russian invasion so far. And with every day, of course, that number climbs. And they aren't coming alone. Many are bringing beloved pets that are often hungry and dehydrated. And yeah, I hate to say it, those animals are actually the lucky ones, as shelters and sanctuaries within Ukraine struggle to feed and rescue vulnerable animals left behind and under fire. My next guest is part of the team trying to make a difference. The International Fund for Animal Welfare is on the ground helping to heal and register pets on the border, while also crucially supporting those in shelters in Ukraine. Joining me now is Shannon Wolitis. She is the organization's Director of Disaster Response and Risk Reduction. And so good to have you here. I know so many people have watched those wrenching images of family members holding on tight to their pets. And worse, right? Many so distressed by the animals they've had to leave behind. You know, what's the need as you see it right now, and what has your organization been able to do to help?
Well, it's a horrible situation for everyone involved, of course. There are still hundreds of thousands of refugees leaving every day, many of them with pets. And they cross over the border in three primary ways, whether it's by train, bus, car, or by foot, walking kilometers at a time. They reach Poland, where we are, and because there, we have Ukrainian vets and translators that greet them in their native language to let them know that they're safe and that we are there to help with any of the basic needs that their pets may need. It's absolutely a lifeline for these folks that they were able to bring their pets with them. We are so grateful for the opportunity to have our team on the ground be that first face that they see and be able to offer them those things that they need for their pets to carry on their journey. That's food, water, a sweater, harnesses, leashes, veterinary attention. We're making sure that they have what they need. Things that they may not have been able to pick up on their way as they're literally leaving a bombing, shelling, gunfire. They made the difficult decision to take that extra minute to grab their pet, and we're so grateful. We see them coming across the border in their owner's coats or shirts, a bag, a box, anything you can imagine, a cooler with holes poked in the side of it. We're seeing all sorts of pets come over, and we are so grateful that the EU Commission provided the guidance to EU countries to say, please waive that pet entry requirement. Let people bring their pets out, because this is saving lives. There are so many, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of these refugees may have made the difficult decision to leave their family in harm's way because they knew they would have to leave their pet. They didn't have a plan outside of the country. And we're again, very grateful to have the opportunity to serve them, to make their burden a little less heavy as they carry on to wherever they may end up, knowing that the pet is healthy, has the appropriate vaccinations, microchip, and that veterinary attention is so critical to treat the conditions of that extreme stress, the dehydration, not having eaten, just like their parents.
Yeah, it's terrible. We're looking at some of the video that your organization provided. You know, I've been floored by reading about how much you guys have been able to accomplish. You mentioned the EU protocols being dropped, but also the vets and the volunteers chipping in. How worried are you, though, about the animals left behind in Ukraine right now?
Well, we're all very worried about the animals that have not been able to evacuate, depending on their situation, whether they are confined wildlife, they are in a animal shelter with large numbers of cats and dogs in harm's way. We have to make sure that we continue to supply them with the necessary supplies through every route that we can possibly find. We're getting in food, fresh water, we're getting in medication to help treat animals that are injured, but also taking care of those caregivers that are staying behind. And what we really need everyone's support with is getting those safe evacuation routes so that we can continue to not only provide the supplies that folks need inside Ukraine, but for those that do wish to evacuate, we need to help get them out safely. And we just need to do whatever we can.
Shannon, I don't have a lot of time left, but some watching, what they're going to say. Human lives are on the line. Why work so hard to save the animals? I'll weigh in personally and say, it diminishes our humanity to abandon these animals to this suffering. But what would you say to them?
I would say that saving animals saves humans. Please keep in mind the hundreds of thousands of individuals that have made the decision to stay behind because they have taken on the responsibility for caring for animals, be it wild animals, livestock, dogs, cats, other animals that people have dedicated their own, they basically have given up their own safety to say, I'm staying because I can't leave safely with my animals. And I've made a commitment to them, as we all do, any of us who have taken care of animals in our lives, in our families. That responsibility is ingrained in our human nature. And we need to respect decisions that people have made to stay in harm's way because they are going to continue to care for animals that cannot evacuate. And we just need to respect decisions.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that for so many, it is a lifeline. Think about the elderly and the children that are, grasping those beloved pets for dear life as they cross those borders. Shannon, thanks so much. Really appreciate your perspective on this.
Thank you.
Coming up after the break, Elon Musk has scooped up one of the world's largest social media companies. His deal with Twitter has raised a lot of questions, though. We'll try and get to some answers after the break. All right, topping so many business headlines, a multi-billion-dollar deal to buy one of the world's most influential platforms. Twitter's board unanimously approved Elon Musk's offer to buy the company. And here's the clincher, take it private. Twitter stock soared on the news, and so did the questions about what the future holds. Dan Ives, Senior Equity Research Analyst at Wedbush Securities, joins me now. You've certainly been following this. We've been watching your takes, but remind everyone about your hot take about when this broke and the fact that you think this really is a stellar deal for shareholders, and let us assume it's not a vanity project for Musk. How the heck does he make money with this thing now?
Look, I mean, if you're a Twitter shareholder, I mean, pick whether it's whiskey, bourbon, Cabernet, rosé. That's what you're drinking right now. Because for a Twitter shareholder, I mean, this is beyond best case scenario. I mean, this is a stock that would be $30 if it wasn't for Musk owning it. Now, for Musk, look, it's a head scratcher because fundamentally he's paying a massive price. The reason there was no other white knight or PE, because you just couldn't get around for this business to pay that type of premium. And that's, look, and that fundamentally, the easy part for Musk was buying it. The hard part, it's going to fix it.
When you say fix it, I'll get to the free speech implications in the first place, but you have to make money. So what do? Subscription service, live events. I mean, Twitter hasn't been able to crack the code now for years.
That's been the issue. I mean, for a decade, it's been a massively underperforming social media platform. We could talk about Twitter in terms of elections, Trump, and all the controversies, but it hasn't made money. See, that's the fundamental issue here is that, okay, is he going to turn into a subscription platform? We talk about freedom of speech, but he just spent 20% of his net worth on Twitter. So it needs to be more from a monetization perspective, even just given some of the collateralized loans. And I think that's the question now. I mean, of course, they'll go private. They'll have success relative to Musk, ultimately navigating it. But I think there's more questions than answers in terms of how he's going to change it. Subscription's probably the most immediate, but can he be successful? Dorsey and others, for 10 years, this has been a Herculean-like battle.
Yeah, Jack Dorsey, one of the original co-founders of Twitter, having a cryptic message. Jeff Bezos was a little bit more direct, right? One rich man telling the other rich man, look, this is perhaps giving even China an in and some influence over you. How do you think Elon Musk sees it? Because I would argue for someone who already has a lot of money, point taken that he did spend a lot of his money to get Twitter, this is a power move, right? There's a lot of influence that comes with owning Twitter.
No doubt. Look, as a Tesla analyst or if you're an investor, you don't want to see him go after Twitter. There's no tangential benefit. It's a lightning rod of controversy, right? This is almost a category 5 tornado that really comes with it in terms of Twitter. And as Bezos talked about, the worry is is there a political blowback for Tesla, for SpaceX? And these are all the questions now going forward for Musk, because in the game of high stakes poker, he won. Twitter's board was back against the wall. They had to ultimately come to a deal. But now what does he do with Twitter? That remains, I think right now, there's more questions there than answers.
And before I let you go, how difficult do you think it will be for him to navigate the area of free speech and the fact that many just say, look, Twitter's a cesspool, it's toxic, and to go towards it being even freer is going to cause a world of headaches and hurt?
It's a tightrope. Because ultimately, okay, you go more freedom of speech, then what happens if users leave the platform? That's how you monetize it. So this is one where freedom of speech is one thing, spending $44 billion on it and turning it around. Can you monetize it? It's a tight wire act for Musk. And again, trading Tesla stock for Twitter, it's like trading caviar for a $2 pretzel on Park Ave.
He clearly has a plan. We will all wait to see what that is as it unfolds in the coming days, weeks, months. Stan Ives, appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And finally, here for us on First Move, what were you doing at the age of 13? Yeah, meet young Elliot Tanner, who is about to get a degree in physics. His mom says he started reading by himself at the age of 3. Now Elliot has accepted in a position for a PhD program at the University of Minnesota. And get this, he didn't get any money, didn't get any financial aid, so friends and family are raising money for his tuition through a GoFundMe page. And Elliot, I wish you luck in more than 5 decades on this earth, not able to crack that physics code. All right, that's it for our show. Stay with CNN, though. Connect the World with Eleni Giokos is next.
My Ukrainian friends, we know the burden that you all carry, and we know, and you should know, that all of us have your back.
The U.S. Defense Secretary shows strong support for Ukraine and says the U.S. and its allies believe the country can win the war.
I know that we have today, facing the complex situation in Ukraine, different interpretations about what's happening in Ukraine.
After face-to-face talks with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, the UN Secretary General again called for an immediate suspension of hostilities. He's expected to meet with President Putin soon.
Russian forces are increasingly hitting the same target twice. It's called a double tap, a horrifying strategy to take out rescue workers as they respond.
Brave Ukrainian paramedics put their lives at risk trying to save others. CNN joins them on their dangerous job. I'm Eleni Jarkos in Abu Dhabi. Hello and welcome to Connect the World. Great to have you with us today. Lots to get through. Russia's president is scheduled to meet with UN Secretary General soon in what's become a day of diplomacy in this ruthless war in Ukraine. And this comes just hours after Antonio Guterres met with Russia's foreign minister and called out Moscow for violating the UN Charter.
According to the Russian Federation, what is taking place is a special military operation with the objectives that were announced. According to the UN, in line with the resolutions passed by the General Assembly, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a violation of its territorial integrity and against the Charter of the United Nations.
And earlier today, dozens of nations joined the US Defense Secretary in Germany for talks on Ukraine. In his opening remarks, Austin slammed Russia and its leader.
Russia's invasion is indefensible, and so are Russian atrocities. We all start today from a position of moral clarity. Russia is waging a war of choice to indulge the ambitions of one man. Ukraine is fighting a war of necessity to defend its democracy, its sovereignty, and its citizens. But the stakes reach beyond Ukraine and even beyond Europe.
And on the ground in Ukraine, a nighttime curfew is now in effect in Kyiv, and that's due to what authorities call Russian provocations. Russian troops have now taken control of Kherson's city council, and that's weeks after they first occupied the city. Kherson's mayor posted on social media that armed men entered the building, took the keys, and replaced Ukrainian guards with their own. Meanwhile, the mayor of Mariupol says a third mass grave has been found near his city. He's also accusing Russian troops of forcing civilians to work at these sites in exchange for food and water. Right, so it's lots to unpack here, but let's begin with the UN Secretary General's trip to Moscow. Joining me now from New York, we have former UN Assistant Secretary General Franz Baumann. Franz, really good to have you with us. Listening to Sergei Lavrov and listening to Antonio Guterres after their meeting, what did you make of the UN Secretary General's messaging, and do you think it was sufficient during this time of crisis?
Thank you, Eleni. He spoke very clearly, very forcefully, and he was absolutely right. The problem was that he should have said this 3 months ago. Guterres has, under Article 99 of the Charter, the duty to bring to the attention of the Security Council threats to peace. He should have traveled to Beijing for the Olympics and met with Putin and Xi and said, please, no thoughts of invading Ukraine. Now, the baby is in the well. It is too late, and he will not get himself into a good role as a mediator if he says this. So in a way, the horse has bolted, sadly, tragically, but he is right in substance, but too late.
And In fact, you, France, with 200 other former UN officials have written an open letter to Guterres. And you specifically point out, and this is so important because we mustn't let this fade in memory, that when there was a Russian military buildup around Ukraine, Putin and Moscow were saying, look, this in no way is a threat to Ukraine's sovereignty. And that is your argument now, that there should have been a move by the UN when this messaging was happening. But Moscow now has morphed its messaging, hasn't it? So what do you make now of what Sergei Lavrov is saying and what Russians' true intentions might be? Because we've been deceived so much in the past few months.
I can't read it. Makes no sense whatsoever, because Russia has unified Ukraine, has unified the European Union, has unified NATO. So that was certainly not their intent. So I do not know what actually it is that they're after. But, you know, the UN Secretary General is not a psychologist. He has to go by what is on the ground, and that is a huge military buildup. So he has to remind the country of Russia that the UN membership means peaceful resolution of conflict. It means that Ukraine has a right for self-determination, and that Russia cannot use force or even threaten force. So if Russia is in line of violating that, the Secretary General should have gone to China, to New Delhi, to Pretoria, to Brasilia, to enlist all the countries of the world before the outbreak that they will stand with a charter then, not now, then.
Yeah. And you're making such a good point on that, because even Sergei Lavrov at one point started getting into the macro picture, saying that Africa and the global south have very little representation in the UN in terms of permanent seats. I want to bring in our correspondent, Nick Robertson, who's standing by for us as well. Nick, what really stood out for me is when Sergei Lavrov says, listen, it doesn't help that the US and other countries, what he called pumping Ukraine with weapons. It's not helping, you know, getting people to the negotiating table. But on the other end of the spectrum, Russia's not exactly showing that it really does want to negotiate by way of its military action that we're seeing playing out minute by minute in various parts of the country.
It seems that Russia absolutely wants to crush any resistance in Mariupol. It's not therefore in their strategic interest to have a humanitarian corridor there, to give the opportunity to have some international presence, as the UN Secretary General is suggesting, the UN and the Red Cross to be on the ground there, because that gives the Russians the perceptions that that would become a sort of a standard around which the Ukrainians and the international community can unite to deny Russia the control you know, in the later phases of the war when they come of Mariupol. That's something that they don't want. I think we heard Sergei Lavrov as well criticizing votes at the United Nations, alleging that the United States has somehow been bribing lesser UN members to vote their way, saying that they were threatening their bank accounts, even threatening their children's education. Unfounded accusations flying there from Sergei Lavrov, but nothing new from him. So pushing back. I think Sergei Lavrov as well, by saying, to your point, that those that are calling for the defeat of Russia, who are stuffing Ukraine full of weapons, are the ones, in fact, who are keeping this war going. And of course, that gets to the Secretary General's point that the that Russia is abrogating the terms of the UN Charter. Russia doesn't seem to understand the point that the Secretary General is making, that Ukraine has this right to territorial integrity, to its sovereignty, and to be able to turn to security partners of its choice. Russia, in the words of Lavrov, seems to think that Ukraine should roll over and allow Russia to come in, and that any support that they're getting to stop that is somehow wrong, that Russia can choose to be the aggressor and get away with it. So, you know, the Secretary General has a very, very, very tough conversation to have, but a necessary conversation. And I'm sure he's quite well aware of the reception and the realities of the behind-the-doors meetings he's having.
France, you know, you're a former advisor on peace operations. You know, embarking on negotiations when it comes to securing peace, especially with an aggressor to the level of what we're seeing coming through from Putin, I'm sure must be very tough. When we heard Guterres saying what is true and obvious is that there are no Ukrainian soldiers or troops in Russia, but there are Russian troops in Ukraine. It was a pretty clear message. How do you think that is going to sit with Putin ahead of the meeting with Putin, when Guterres and Putin are going to be talking about a way forward here?
Well, you know, I'm very happy that Guterres is speaking so frankly and so precisely and so clearly, because it is not, as we've just heard, this is not about Ukraine encroaching on Russia or NATO encroaching on Russia. The last extension, eastward extension of NATO was 18 years ago in 2004. Putin happened to be in Berlin when Schröder, the then chancellor, mentioned this. They gave a press conference and he was asked, Mr. President Putin, are you scared? Are you worried about NATO extension eastward to the Baltics and to Poland? And Putin said, no, I'm not scared. So this is clearly not the reason. Putin is not scared by NATO, because NATO, Finland or Lithuania or Poland have or Germany, no intent on occupying, threatening Russian territory. We want to buy gas and we want to sell cars, Germany. So this is completely invented, like the denazification and all this kind of stuff. I think Putin is worried about a westernized Ukraine, so that people in Moscow, St. Petersburg will have funny ideas. Oh, look, that they are doing so well. Look, 30 years ago, Russia and China had the same gross domestic product, and now China has 10 times as much. Russia is a failing, corrupt state. German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt called it a gas station with rockets. And Putin does not want his people to look at a flourishing westernized Ukraine. So that's the background. And so Guterres cannot go into the psychology of the Russian president, but he has to remind him, and he did, of what the charter obligations were. Now, if I may make one more point, Guterres will not convince Putin to make peace, because Putin and Zelensky think that they are successful in the battlefield. So therefore, what Guterres can achieve now, the maximum, is humanitarian corridors, stop the shelling, and that's why I hope, sincerely hope, that he will announce to Putin that he, Guterres, will go to Mariupol, that he will go to Kharkiv, and then dare the Russians to shoot at him.
Frans Baumann, thank you very much for your insights. Nick Robertson, always good to have you shedding light on these issues. Great to have you both with us. Now, and as fighting ramps up in eastern Ukraine, the demands on healthcare workers have become nearly unbearable. Many are putting their lives at risk every day to save others. CNN's Clarissa Ward and her team followed two brave paramedics as they helped a wounded man during heavy shelling in Kharkiv.
It's the beginning of a 24-hour shift for paramedics Alexandra Rutkowskaya and Vladimir Wenzel. They prepare their ambulance for the carnage that Kharkiv residents confront every day. We have two tourniquets, Vladimir says. Alexandra's mother stops by the dispatch center to give her daughter a hug. This is one of the most dangerous jobs. Every moment together is precious. A loud stream of boom signals the day's work is beginning. That's incoming now, this ambulance worker tells us. Alexandra and Vladimir answer the call. Temperatura, she says, the code used when someone has been wounded by shelling. Their flak jackets on, they're ready to roll out.
So they've said that they've got reports one person at least has been injured in the shelling, and they're hearing some rockets as well, so we're going to see what's going on.
The shells hit a residential apartment building. The paramedics need to act fast. Russian forces are increasingly hitting the same target twice. It's called a double tap, a horrifying strategy to take out rescue workers as they respond. As we see for ourselves. Get in, Vladimir shouts. Faster, faster, faster. We take cover under the stairwell. Alexandra is trying to find the wounded person, but there's no signal. At that moment, another barrage goes off. We brace for the impact.
All right, bye for now, yeah?
Is everybody okay? Alexandra asks. Our team member, Maria Avdieva, has cut up her hands on broken glass. Vladimir treats her injuries, as Alexandra calls the dispatch again to find where the wounded are. We've got no connection. We're sitting in the entrance, she says, and they're shelling the shit out of us. The connection keeps dropping. Finally, she gets through to the person who called for the ambulance. Tell me your damn house number, she says. I repeat, 12G. I've told you 1,000 times, he replies. The man is dying. We decide to try to make a run for it.
1, 2, 3, let's go. Go. Come on, Maria. Maria, come on. Come on, Maria. Come on. Go, go. In the car. In the car. Slide over, slide over. Ambulance was hit, yeah?
Yeah. Okay, so we were just in an apartment building. They were looking for an injured man. A bunch of rounds came in and hit the next door building, so now we are getting out as fast as we can.
While we run out, Vladimir and Alexandra run back in. We find them treating the injured man on the side of the road. Their back window has been blown out by the blasts. He has shrapnel injuries and head trauma. Once they've stabilized him, they rush him to the hospital. Vladimir asks about his pain. The man has been deafened by the blast. Arriving at the hospital, they've done their part. It's up to others now to save him.
I have to say, I think you guys are like the bravest people I have ever met.
Back at base, we ask them why they continue to do this work, with all the danger it entails. It's normal. This is our work. Of course it's scary, like for everyone, Alexandra says. Today you were with us in the hottest place, in the oven, but we're still alive, thank God. You feel it's your duty or obligation, Vladimir tells us, to help the people who are still here.
And what do your parents say? What does your family say? Aren't they wanting you to stop this work?
No comments. No comments, very difficult
They must be scared.
Yes, yes.
Proud, but scared.
Call all day, all night.
We saw your mother.
Yes.
Ваша мама сегодня.
Да, приходила.
Она волнуется.
Очень волнуется.
She's worried to the point of hysteria, Alexandra tells us. She says you need to leave. You need to go to some safe place. Why are you doing this? I have only one child. Stop it.
And what do you say?
Я должна.
I have to do it, she says simply. And with that, they go back to cleaning their ambulance. Their shift only halfway through. Clarissa Ward, CNN, Kharkiv.
And still to come, the impact the world's richest person could have on Twitter now that Elon Musk is set to buy the social media platform. That's all coming up. Twitter's employees have a lot of questions after the company agreed to sell itself to Tesla's CEO Elon Musk. It's a roughly $44 billion deal that would take Twitter private. It would also put the world's richest person in charge of one of the most influential social networks. Pending a thumbs up from regulators and shareholders, of course. Musk is both a high-profile Twitter user and a controversial one. The billionaire has used the platform to spread misleading claims about COVID-19 and make offensive remarks about the transgender community. Musk says his goal is to bolster free speech on Twitter, calling it the digital town square, where matters vital to the future of humanity are debated. Let's go to CNN's Rahel Solomon, who's live in New York for us. Rahel, really good to have you on. Look, firstly, the valuation is out of this world. This is huge money for its shareholders. If I had to just look at the price to earnings ratio, it makes one's eyes water. But again, Elon Musk is sort of touting this as, you know, him coming in and helping humanity, you know, free speech, and he's almost, you know, looking at it from an egalitarian perspective. What part of this should we believe?
Hi, Eleni. Good to be with you. Yeah, that's sort of the cause that he's championing, right? That he wants to expand free speech. But the concern that we've seen, and Twitter has been ripe with concern ever since this news broke yesterday afternoon at about 3 p.m. Eastern, is what does that even look like at a platform that's already been considered by some to be toxic and divisive and even harmful? And so we know that that's one of his sort of platforms. What exactly that will look like, it's unclear because of all of these concerns. In fact, one of the largest and longtime supporters of free speech here in the States tweeting their concerns. Take a look at this tweet from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, tweeting, "We should be worried about any powerful central actor, whether it's a government or any wealthy individual, even if it is an ACLU member, having so much control over the boundaries of our political speech online." To that point, fellow billionaire and also the owner of the Washington Post newspaper here in the States, also posing a question on Twitter. Jeff Bezos saying, interesting question, did the Chinese government just gain a bit of leverage over the town square? A reference to that tweet, Eleni, that you had pointed out at the beginning of this hit, but also a question and a reference to Tesla's Shanghai factory and Elon Musk's relationship with Chinese officials. So many questions about how this is all going to shake out. But I think what's clear is it really sort of signifies and it shows and illustrates how important and influential Twitter has become in our system, in our globe.
Yeah, and look, the EU Commission is also raising a flag. It's saying that Twitter needs to comply with the rules in the EU and that Musk knows this very well. Is this sort of a threat coming through in terms of what he could face in Europe?
It certainly does appear so, Eleni, right? Take a look at these comments. I'd say pretty strong comments and coming out pretty swiftly after that news yesterday. These are from EU Commissioner Thierry Breton telling the FT, the Financial Times, that Elon, there are rules. You are welcome, but these are our rules. It's not your rules which will apply here. So yes, perhaps a veiled threat, or if nothing else, putting Elon Musk on guard. Of course, Twitter, a global company, so even how he plans to expand free speech but also comply within the global framework remains to be seen. But those comments, of course, coming after the EU passed sweeping legislation cracking down on big tech and cracking down on misinformation on the internet. And Eleni, for all of the concerns, he does have one major supporter in his corner. That would be Jack Dorsey, essentially saying, in part, that he doesn't believe that anyone should own Twitter, but that Elon is the singular solution I trust. So.
Interesting. Look, it's a great price tag for him and the shareholders. Interesting times. Rahel, thank you very much for your time. Great to have you on. Let's move on now. Chinese authorities are racing to contain a fresh Omicron outbreak that's spreading fast in Beijing. Some 20 million people in the capital city are being tested for COVID. Since Friday, 80 cases have been reported there, and fears of more restrictions have triggered panic buying. Shoppers have been emptying store shelves, while online food delivery apps have been selling out of some of those food items. Now, much of the fear in Beijing is being driven by what's happening in Shanghai. Millions of people there have been kept inside under a strict lockdown for weeks. And as CNN's David Culver reports, the government censors are struggling to silence the complaints.
It's the video Chinese censors do not want you to see or share, as it sparked a rare digital uprising on social media this weekend, highlighting a shared misery and helplessness felt across Shanghai. The video points to dysfunction, mismanagement, a city in chaos, struggling to cope with a surge in COVID cases. It resonates with so many of Shanghai's 25 million residents feeling trapped, turning to the most popular Chinese communication platforms, Weibo and WeChat, to vent. Amidst what is government-controlled internet, with any dissent quickly suppressed and erased, China's censors over the weekend struggled to keep up. No sooner would they block one version of the video, did another resurface, rapidly multiplying, flooding China's cyberspace. Some versions even disguised as QR codes to throw off the censors. The online rattling of social stability was a growing rejection of China's harsh COVID containment measures. Some even sharing this clip from the 2012 movie Les Mis, referencing a 19th century uprising in Paris. The censors swiftly clamped down, extinguishing the spread. But the users also taking aim at the obvious censorship itself, sharing clips of their own officials proclaiming China's citizens have a right to freely express themselves. Seemingly ironic, given even the first line of China's own national anthem is now blocked online. The words, "Rise, those who don't want to be enslaved," now used as a veiled reference to criticize their own government. For some, Shanghai feels like the world's largest prison. CNN witnessing it firsthand. The extent of my freedom is all the way to my terrace door here. We're lucky enough to at least get some fresh air outside. Our community volunteer is sending me this image of what's on the other side of our door, a freshly taped paper seal, a reminder not to leave. And if I manage to get out, there's now a COVID guard posted day and night. Outside several apartment compounds, fences going up, neighbors sharing shocking images of new barriers on social media. Listen to them howl from their balconies as they're further caged in. Some finding workarounds, buying their groceries through the added layer. Others desperately rattling locks, hoping to escape. And then there are those who manage to tear down the walls. For folks locked into their homes, scenes like this are a terrifying reality. An apartment fire over the weekend in Shanghai's business district. State media quick to report that everyone got out safely. But it raises questions. Might these COVID barriers be more of a danger than the virus itself? And if you thought the city might be near reopening or easing lockdowns, images from the streets of Shanghai show giant containers, not bringing in much needed supplies, but rather helping to build more blockades. This as more positive cases and close contacts are rounded up and sent to government quarantine facilities. Some left to sleep in tents in the middle of deserted streets as their dormitories are disinfected. As the rising tune of discontent echoes throughout the eerily empty metropolis, for many, Shanghai has fallen. David Culver, CNN, Shanghai.
Ahead on Connect the World, the daily heartache a Ukrainian woman is enduring after her husband stays behind in Mariupol to fight against Russia. Welcome back. I'm Eleni Jarkos in Abu Dhabi, and you're watching Connect the World. The sooner the war in Ukraine ends, the better for everyone. Those comments from UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres ahead of his face-to-face meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Guterres calling himself a messenger of peace. Now, earlier he sat down with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Guterres outlined the differing views of what has been happening in Ukraine over the past 2 months. Take a listen.
According to the Russian Federation, what is taking place is a special military operation with the objectives that were announced. According to the UN, in line with the resolutions passed by the General Assembly, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a violation of its territorial integrity and against the Charter of the United Nations.
For their meeting, Lavrov warned that while Russia considers nuclear war inadmissible, the danger of it happening is real and cannot be underestimated. Guterres will visit Ukraine after leaving Moscow. Now, the mayor of Mariupol says a third mass grave has been discovered near the city, and he's accusing Russian troops of forcing civilians to work at the sites in exchange for food and water. Now, CNN cannot independently confirm that. The giant steel plant in the besieged city is the last major line of defense for Ukrainian forces. Matt Rivers spoke to the wife of a soldier who stayed behind to defend Mariupol.
Before Mariupol became a hellscape, before Russian military depravity turned a city into a cemetery, there was love here. Just 2 weeks before the war began, Natalka Zaritska spent Valentine's Day with her boyfriend in the city. They took this picture at a cafe, and this one after eating. And a few days later, she snapped this one of him from her window seat on the train that would take her back to Kyiv.
He kissed me and told Natalia, I don't know when I will see you again.
Resignation from a man who understood the realities of the war to come. Natalka's boyfriend, who we are not naming or showing for security reasons, is a soldier in the Azov Battalion, a unit that has fought the Russians in Mariupol for months. We went to see Natalka at her home in Kyiv, where she told us her boyfriend was given a command to, quote, fight until the last drop of blood.
What did you think when he told you that?
I recommended him to save his life, but he answered, no, I should keep on the command. I am a soldier and I have to be here.
She says her boyfriend lost cell service on March 3rd. His silence was as deafening as the bombs that by then had started to fall around Kyiv, forcing her and her family down into this cellar. It was in here that after 2 weeks, she heard from him.
When he called, it could be 10 or 15 seconds and then bombing and no connections.
But with what connection he did have, he would send her videos of the utter destruction that surrounded him. We can't show you those for security reasons.
What do you think when you watch these videos?
I think they're empty. I feel they're empty, absolute empty.
Along with the videos were selfies and texts, and on his birthday, a particularly special message.
He gave me a proposition that I couldn't
say no to.
Say no, yeah.
What did he write to you?
Чи згодна ти зі мною одружитися? So I love you, and do you want to be my wife?
A few days later, a marriage certificate made it official. Now a wife, she says she refuses to cry. Her husband is stoic in the face of death, so she will be too. How else to describe her reaction to the last message he sent?
My husband told me that, Natalia, please be glad, because very soon it will finish.
When you say it's going to finish very soon, what are the two options?
Very simple. They will alive or they will be killed. Just two options.
Matt Rivers, CNN, Kyiv, Ukraine.
And if you'd like to help people in Ukraine who may be in need of shelter, food and water, please go to cnn.com/impact. You'll find several ways that you can help. Right, we're going to a very short break. We'll be right back after this. Stay with CNN. Moldova's government is convening a meeting of its Security Council today following a series of explosions in the breakaway region of Transnistria. Ukraine has blamed Russia, the defense ministry in Kyiv calling it a planned provocation, possibly to justify military intervention by Moscow. CNN's Bianca Nobler reports there are already hundreds of Russian troops stationed there.
Transnistria is a breakaway territory in Moldova, not recognized by the international community. It's a narrow slither of land of around 1,350 square miles, sandwiched between Moldova and Ukraine. It's a self-proclaimed republic. It's got its own constitution, currency, military and flag. It's home to around 500,000 people, the majority of whom are Russian speakers. So when a senior Russian commander said there's, quote, evidence that the Russian-speaking population in Transnistria is being oppressed, it sent a chill down the Moldovan spine, as that echoes the justification the Kremlin used for its invasion of Ukraine. So some background here. Transnistria declared its independence from the former Soviet Republic of Moldova in 1990, just as the Soviet Union was collapsing. The Russians stepped in to back Transnistria, but they never recognized it as an independent state. Then, in March 1992, this split erupted into a full-blown military conflict between the Moldovan government and separatists, ending in a ceasefire about 4 months later. But around 1,500 Russian troops have remained in Transnistria since then, despite the objection of the Moldovan government. And following Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, pro-Russian politicians in Transnistria asked the Russian parliament to draft a law that would allow Transnistria to join Russia. Then in 2016, Transnistria introduced a law that would punish anyone showing disrespect to Russian armed forces in the region, anything from a fine to 3 years in jail. So the depth of this connection between Transnistria and Russia helps explain why in the lead up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there were claims from Ukrainian military intelligence. They had evidence Russia was covertly planning false flag provocations against their own soldiers in Transnistria. All of that was denied by Russia. But some military analysts suspect that Russia plans to lean on Transnistria for logistical support and potentially establish a land corridor along the Black Sea coast to help them capture and consolidate the strategic port city of Odessa in Ukraine.
And that was CNN's Bianca Nobler reporting there from London. Now, the Wall Street Journal reports the US is holding off on sanctions against Vladimir Putin's rumored girlfriend. Alina Kabaeva is a Russian gymnast turned lawmaker, now the chair of the pro-Putin new media group. She's also allegedly the mother of at least 3 children fathered by Putin. The White House tells the Wall Street Journal they're not imposing sanctions because they feel it would be too much of a personal escalation. Kabaeva made a rare public appearance over the weekend at a gymnastics event she hosts in Moscow. Now, in the besieged southern city of Mariupol, there's still no safe way out for hundreds of civilians sheltering inside the Azovstal steel plant. On Monday, Ukraine said it was unable to establish humanitarian corridors to evacuate the plant, and conditions inside seem to be growing increasingly desperate. Ukrainian forces released this video on Sunday. Okay, we are going to intervene on this. We have Jim Shuto, who's about to interview General Marks Milley, and here we go, over to our colleague
now
in
is
the
the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. General, thanks so much for taking the time this morning.
Jim, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
It's good to have you on.
Can you hear me, Jim?
This phrasing that Secretary Austin used yesterday, the goal of weakening Russia. Has the U.S. aim in this conflict expanded beyond just helping Ukraine defend itself to an aim of degrading Russia's military so it cannot attack other countries?
Yeah, thanks, Jim, for that. First, I want to thank you for just being in Lviv and covering the war. The media coverage has been really critical to making sure the truth gets out about what is happening. As you know, and we all know now, the entire world knows, there's an unprovoked war of aggression by Russia on a much smaller country. With respect to what we're trying to do, the United States and all of the allied countries, and we just finished a conference with about 42 countries from around the world, not just NATO, to coordinate and synchronize continued and sustained military, lethal and non-lethal support to Ukraine in their fight for freedom. At the end of the day, what we want to see, what I think the policy of all of our governments together is a free and independent Ukraine with their territory intact and their government standing, and the Russian aggression has been halted and stopped. And at the end of the day, I think that's going to involve a weakened Russia, a strengthened NATO, and as you see, Finland and Sweden and other countries, and the unity of the West and the unity of NATO, and indeed the unity of the globe has probably never been stronger than it is in the face of this unprovoked aggression. So that's where we're heading.
As you look at Russian forces focus their attention now on the eastern part of the country and the south, have they made sufficient adjustments in terms of, for instance, supply lines, but also command and control to have more success in the east than they had in the north around Kyiv?
That remains to be seen, Jim. As you know, they struggled mightily with command and control, fighting at night, establishing air supremacy and air superiority. They had a real difficult time with logistical resupply and a wide variety of other challenges and issues. Most of that was caused by the bravery, the talent, the skill of the Ukrainians on the ground and fighting in accordance with the training that NATO and other allies have given them over many, many years. So war is a two-way street. There's action, reaction, counteraction. And the first part of this operation, the strategic attempt to seize Kiev in a lightning strike, the attempt to untopple the Zelensky government failed. And now what the Russians are trying to do is essentially envelop and then crush about half of the Ukrainian army down around the line of contact. The Ukrainians are set. They're ready for this fight. And our task here in NATO and in the West is to continue to support Ukraine in their fight for freedom.
You've heard the comments from the Russian foreign minister just in the last 24 hours saying that Russia does not want to artificially inflate the nuclear risk, but he called the risk serious. And you've heard comments on Russian state TV where they even celebrate that prospect to some degree. I wonder, has the U.S. seen any unusual or new movements of Russian nuclear forces or weapons that would indicate that that commentary is more than just rhetoric?
Well, anytime a senior leader of a nation state starts rattling a nuclear saber, then everyone takes it seriously. And it's completely irresponsible for any senior leader to be talking like that in today's world. We are monitoring, as a military, we're monitoring very closely with all of our friends and allies, and we take those things very seriously.
Short of a nuclear risk, you testified before Congress a short time ago that the potential for significant international conflict is increasing, not decreasing. I'm quoting you. Since then, Russia has issued a diplomatic protest to the U.S. and NATO to stop its weapons shipments. Has that increase in military support, in your view, increase the danger of direct conflict between the U.S. and Russia?
Yeah, I actually think it's the opposite. I think that what's at stake here is much greater than Ukraine. What's at stake is the security of Europe. This is the greatest challenge to the security of Europe since the end of World War II. And indeed, you can easily make the case that what's at stake is the global international security order that was put in place in 1945. That international order has lasted 78 years. It's prevented great power war. And underlining that entire concept is the idea that large nations will not conduct military aggression against smaller nations. And that is exactly what's happened here, an unprovoked military aggression by Russia against a smaller nation. So if this is left to stand, if there is no answer to this aggression, if Russia gets away with this cost-free, then so goes the so-called international order. And if that happens, then we're entering into an era of seriously increased instability. So right now, now is the time, and right now is the opportunity here to stop aggression and to restore peace and security to the European continent.
Throughout your service and your command, you've been vigilant about the threat of disinformation, particularly from a nation such as Russia. We've seen a whole host of it in this conflict so far. When you see some of that disinformation repeated by Americans in American circles, including, for instance, this false charge about the U.S. funding chemical weapons operations here in this country, what's your reaction to that?
Propaganda and disinformation, Jim, as you know, is a student of warfare. That has been around since the earliest days of recorded time. And today, the means and mechanisms of disinformation and propaganda are fundamentally different with television or print media or social media, etc. But the idea of disinformation, of spewing propaganda out, has been around for a long time. And that is happening today. The Russians are doing it on a continual basis, not only in Europe, but around the world, to make their case for what is a completely unjustified attack on a smaller nation.
General Mark Milley, we appreciate you taking the time, and we appreciate your service.
That was General Mark Milley there speaking to our colleague Jim Sciutto, and of course really important conversations to have about the reaction and response by NATO and allies to assist Ukraine, specifically on weapons and ensuring that they try what they say should win the war. We're going to a very short break, and we'll be back with more news. We'll be following events in Ukraine very closely. Stay with us. Imagine being a foreigner living in Ukraine and having to flee to neighboring Poland. After arriving, you find that you weren't eligible for many benefits and social services because you weren't Ukrainian. And that's in part why a shelter was launched in the Polish capital, run by a Catholic NGO to help non-Ukrainian refugees fleeing the war. Erica Hill filed this report.
After fleeing the war in Ukraine, a chance to just be a kid.
They are drawing what they feel.
She says here she's grateful.
Poland has welcomed nearly 3 million people since the war started, yet not everyone is greeted with open arms.
It's clear that we are more open for, those Slavic people, ethnic groups.
While Ukrainians arriving in Poland can stay for 18 months, work legally, and have access to health care and social services, non-Ukrainians can't. These 3 women knew they could help.
They have only, 2 weeks to think about their next steps, and I can't imagine actually how to do it when you are a war refugee.
Overnight, they started a shelter for non-Ukrainian refugees run by KIK, a Catholic NGO in Poland. With space for 70 guests, they're turning people away daily.
And from the beginning, it's full.
Joel and Daniel, students from Nigeria, were studying management in Kyiv when the war broke out and were reluctant to leave.
It was fun for me, and I would rather love to go back to Ukraine. It was like that. It's a very good country.
You told me when you were looking to leave that it was harder for you because of the way you look, because of the color of your skin.
Yeah, to be honest, yes, it's a challenge.
They finally left 2 weeks ago and are now trying to figure out what's next.
We also try to support our guests in organizing their next steps. So sometimes it's a trip to other countries, but also we try to find flats or apartments, places to stay.
Volunteers, at least a dozen a day, keep the shelter running and help connect refugees to essential services. Among them, 27-year-old Khalid, an IT professional who fled Afghanistan 7 months ago.
I do anything that I can do. It's very good for me because I don't have any other job, and it's a better idea to spend time here.
This effort relies on donations, from clothing and toiletries to food and flowers. Even the space, which has now welcomed more than 500 people from 36 countries, is donated, a generous offer that runs out at the end of May.
How long do you think your help will be needed?
We should be ready to invite new refugees till the end of the next year.
And they're dedicated to meeting that challenge.
I have a feeling that we are really helping those people who are here. We cannot, solve our problems, but this is a small part that we can do.
Our thanks to Erica Hill for bringing us that story. We're going to a short break. More connects the world after this break. Stay with us.
Live from CNN Abu Dhabi, this is Connect the World.
Hello and welcome back to Connect the World. I'm Eleni Jakas. I'm in for my colleague Becky Anderson. Now, working for an end game to Russia's war on Ukraine, when there appears to be no end in sight, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres should be sitting down with Russian President Vladimir Putin any time now. Guterres met with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov earlier and called for quick action.
But it is my deep conviction that the sooner we end this war, the better for the people of Ukraine, for the people of the Russian Federation, and those far beyond.
As talks go on, every day brings new destruction on the ground. Ukraine says its eastern Donbas region is under heavy attack, although it's managed to repel Russian forces in some areas. Mariupol's mayor reports a third mass grave near the city. We haven't confirmed that, but to the west of Ukraine, explosions destroyed 2 towers that broadcast Russian radio in Moldova's breakaway Transnistria region. Our Barbara Starr is at the Pentagon, and CNN military analyst Cedric Layton joins me now from Washington. Barbara, I want to start with you. Importantly, we're going to be hearing from the Defense Secretary, who's currently in Germany. And the important messaging from the US on this visit to Ukraine was that they want to see Russian military weakened to the degree that they cannot do things like this again. How important is what Lloyd Austin is going to say today to the overall direction of what the US is going to be doing in this war?
Well, he is really heading up the effort to get heavy weapons into Ukraine for them to push back against the Russians, both from the U.S. and from the Allies. And that's what his meeting in Germany really has been all about, meeting with several dozen NATO and partner nations to talk about, and the Ukrainians are there as well, to talk about what Ukraine's weapons needs are and how to best fulfill those needs. This is clearly turning into a long-term situation, if you will, weeks if not months, because they do want to weaken Russia. They want the Russian military not to be able to come out of this, to be able to ever do it again. That their sense is that is the way to ensure European security, make sure that Russia would not have the capability to do this again against a smaller neighbor. So I think we're likely to hear Lloyd Austin talk about all of that, talk about the reasoning behind why they want to see a weaker Russia, and then maybe set the stage for the weeks ahead. What else could be coming down the road in terms of Western assistance to Ukraine? Eleni?
All right, Barbara, thank you so much for that insight. Great to have you on. Cedric Layton, great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining us. Again, you know, hearing what the U.S. stance is going to be is vital. And one Ukrainian official said that a big sign that trouble was brewing was when the U.S. sent a message to all businesses and diplomats to leave Ukraine just before the war started. And now the U.S. says they want to send diplomats back into Ukraine. What does this stance, this change in position by the U.S. tell you about their commitment and involvement in Ukraine at this point?
Well, Eleni, it's very clear that the U.S. is ramping up its commitment to Ukraine. They believe that Ukraine can actually sustain this effort and that it can ultimately win this conflict. Of course, there's a lot of work that still has to be done. There are great dangers out in the eastern part of the country, as Barbara was mentioning, for the Ukrainian armed forces. And the danger really focuses on the ability of the Russians, whether or not they can move forward quickly to potentially surround the Ukrainian forces that are based in those regions, the Donbas and in the other eastern regions of the country. So that's going to be a critical element of this. The other thing, of course, to watch for is what's happening in the south, particularly around Kherson, and then from there to Odessa. And then, of course, if there's going to be a renewed push into other areas of the country, those are all critical components. And that is something where if there's a U.S. presence in Kyiv, that, of course, helps manage the war effort and manage the support effort to the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian government.
Cedric, we also have live pictures coming through from Ramstein Air Base. We are waiting for the Defense Secretary to address the press, so we're waiting for that. But before we go to that, I want you to take a listen to what General Mark Milley said a short time ago, as well as some of the messaging from the Defense Secretary. Let's listen in. Okay, there we go. We're going to go live now to Ramstein Air Base for the Defense Secretary.
Over to Secretary Austin, but just a couple of administrative remarks. The Secretary will have some opening comments, and then we'll have time for a few questions. I will moderate those questions from here. I will call on the journalists, and if you could limit your follow-ups if possible. So we've got a bit of a tight timeline this afternoon. So with that, Mr. Secretary.
Well, thanks, John. Good afternoon, everybody. Had some great discussions and a lot of leaders. So let me thank all of the ministers and your ministers and the chiefs of defense
quatre coins du monde.
and your teams for joining us
Donc,
today.
je veux encore souligner adresser mes
Defense Minister Reznikov and his delegation. It's great to see him. Minister Reznikov and his delegation. It's great to see him. We're all coming away with a transparent and shared understanding of the challenge that the Ukrainians face. And I know that we're all determined to help Ukraine win today and build strength for tomorrow. The work that we've done together in record time has made a huge difference on the battlefield. President Zelensky made that clear when we met Sunday in Kyiv. And countries all around the world have been stepping up to meet Ukraine's urgent needs. And I wanted to especially welcome a major decision by our German host, as Minister Lambrecht announced just today that Germany will send Ukraine some 50 Cheetah anti-aircraft systems. And yesterday, of course, the British government announced that it would provide Ukraine with additional anti-aircraft capabilities as well. And today, Canada announced that it will send Ukraine 8 armored vehicles. And so that's important progress. We're seeing more every day. And I applaud all the countries that have risen and are rising to meet this demand. But we don't have any time to waste. The briefings today laid out clearly why the coming weeks will be so crucial for Ukraine. So we've got to move at the speed of war. And I know that all the leaders leave today more resolved than ever to support Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression and atrocities. And I know that we're all determined to do even more to better coordinate our efforts. So I was especially glad to hear General Walters encourage us all to make more determined use of EUCOM's coordination mechanism. Now, to ensure that we continue to build on our progress, we're going to extend this forum beyond today. I'm proud to announce that today's gathering will become a monthly contact group on Ukraine's self-defense. And the contact group will be a vehicle for nations of goodwill to intensify our efforts and coordinate our assistance and focus on winning today's fight and the struggles to come. The monthly meetings may be in person, virtual, or mixed, and they'll extend the transparency, the integration, and the dialogue that we saw today. And let me underscore another key point. We held an important session today on the long-term support for Ukraine's defenses, including what that will take from our defense industrial bases. And that means dealing with the tremendous demand that we're facing for munitions and weapons platforms. And giving our staunch support to Ukraine while also meeting our own requirements and those of our allies and partners. But it also means redoubling our common efforts to strengthen Ukraine's military for the long haul. And I look forward to our discussions in the contact group and elsewhere about how to get that done right. Let me again thank all of the countries who came together today. They've done crucial work, and they sent a powerful signal. We're going to build on today's progress and continue to reach out to nations of goodwill to help Ukraine defend itself. And we'll continue working transparently and urgently with our allies and partners. And we'll continue pushing to support and strengthen the Ukrainian military for the battles ahead. So we leave tonight strengthened, and so does Ukraine. And thank you, and I'll be glad to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Our first question today will come from Sylvie Lantome, AFP. You have a microphone.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, actually, I have a double question for you. Moldova is stepping up its security measures after a series of explosions in the separatist region of Transnistria. Do you think there is a risk of spillover of the conflict to Moldova? And my second question is, after this big meeting about arming Ukraine, aren't you concerned that Putin may become restless and threaten again to use a nuclear weapon?
Well, on the issue of spillover to Moldova because of what we've seen here, a reporting of recent violence, we're still looking to the cause of that. That's still, still doing an analysis there. So, not really sure what that's all about. But that's something that we'll stay focused on. And certainly, we don't want to see any spillover. And again. It's important to make sure that we do everything that we can to ensure that Ukraine is successful, and that's the best way to address that. And your second part of the question there, Sylvie, was
about the risk for Putin to threaten to use nuclear.
Well, you've heard us say a number of times that that kind of rhetoric is very dangerous and unhelpful. Nobody wants to see a nuclear war happen. It's a war that, where all sides lose. And so rattling of sabers and dangerous rhetoric is clearly unhelpful and something that we won't engage in.
Our next question goes to Suzanne Geilhard from ZDF.
Mr. Secretary, what military aid do you now expect from the German government, and do you think the delivery of Leopard tanks is sufficient, in your opinion?
You mean cheetahs, which is what
yes.
Well, let me just say that, and I think you probably heard me say this before as I visited Germany, I consider Germany to be a great friend and an ally. We've served. I've served in Germany as an officer and worked with German forces, and it's always been a real pleasure to work alongside our German partners there. Now, I think it's significant that Germany announced that it was going to provide 50 Cheetah systems. I think those systems will provide real capability for Ukraine. And in terms of what else Germany will do going forward, again, that's a sovereign decision, one that the German leadership will make, and I don't want to speculate on that. I just believe that just based upon everything that I've seen in my interaction with the Minister of Defense and how intently she's been focused on making sure that she can do everything that she can to help and work alongside her partners and allies, that she'll continue to look for ways to be relevant and provide good capability to the Ukrainians as they continue to prosecute this fight.
The next question goes to John Ismay, New York Times.
Mr. Secretary, yesterday you mentioned that one of the United States' goals in Ukraine now was to see Russia weakened. Can you explain more fully what that means, and specifically what do you want to weaken and how you would measure success in that regard?
Yeah, John, so I think we've been pretty clear from the outset. We do want to make it harder for Russia to threaten its neighbors and leave them less able to do that. Now, if you look at what's transpired here in this 62 days or so that Ukraine and Russia have been involved in this struggle here, Russia has, in terms of its land forces, their land forces have been attrited in a very significant way. Casualties are pretty substantial. They've lost a lot of equipment. They've used a lot of precision-guided munitions. They've lost a major surface combatant. And so they are, in fact, in terms of military capability, weaker than when it started. And you know, John, it'll be harder for them to replace some of this capability as they go forward because of the sanctions and the trade restrictions that have been placed on them. And so we would like to make sure, again, that they don't have the same type of capability to bully their neighbors that we saw at the outset of this conflict.
Next question goes to Ute Spangenberger from ARD. There she is.
Hello. How can we guarantee a safe and secure Ukraine in future? Is it possible that Ukraine becomes a member of NATO?
That's again, that'll be a sovereign decision. I think that NATO will always stand by its principles of maintaining an open door. So I don't want to speculate on what could come. I do believe that in the future, if the possibility exists, I think Ukraine will seek to once again apply to become a member of NATO. But again, that's probably a bit down the road, and speculation at this point is not very helpful. I think the first step is to end this conflict, and I think what needs to happen to cause the conflict to come to an end is Mr. Putin needs to make a decision to end this conflict. He's the person that started it. It was unjustified, and of course it'll be his decision to de-escalate and then go back to the negotiating table. And we really all would like to see that happen.
Okay, and the last question today, mindful of our time, goes to Uwe Driesen from TV2 Denmark. Uwe.
Thanks. Mr. Secretary, the Russian foreign minister has warned that there's a danger of a third world war, and there's a real danger of nuclear weapons being used in the present situation. Are you not afraid that the conflict will somehow spin out of control and we will have this nuclear confrontation?
Well, we certainly will do everything within our power and within Ukraine. Ukraine will have the same approach, do everything within their power to make sure it doesn't spin out of control. International communities focused on that as well. I think this any bluster about the use of possibility of use of nuclear weapons is very dangerous and unhelpful. Nobody wants to see a nuclear war. Nobody can win that. And as we do things and as we, take actions, we're always mindful of making sure that we have the right balance and that we're taking the right approach. So there's always a possibility that a number of things can happen, but again, I think it's unhelpful and dangerous to rattle sabers and speculate about the use of nuclear weapons. Thanks.
Thank you all. That's all the time we have for today's press conference. We really appreciate you all coming. Thank you.
Right, live pictures there of the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin at Ramstein Air Base in Germany after meeting with leaders. A forum, he says, will now be repeated every single month, and it will send a very strong message in terms of its commitment in helping Ukraine, but also really giving some insight in terms of what the US's stance will be, and also how other countries are assisting Ukraine with much needed weaponry. And importantly, the big message is that he says that Russia's military has already been weakened and equipment lost that is not easily replaced because of the sanctions. But to discuss this and unpack this, we've got our experts standing by. We've got Aaron Lieberman is at Ramstein Air Base. International diplomatic editor Nick Robertson is in Brussels for us. And we still have CNN military analyst Cedric Layton joining us from Washington. Aaron, you're standing by. This is a forum, he says, is going to be repeated monthly, talking about the commitments by the US and also by allies, and really tough questions, the big questions that were posed to him. The fact that Lavrov was talking about nuclear not being completely ruled out, concerns about what's happening in Moldova. What did you make of some of the messaging here and the fact that leaders are going to be discussing this more frequently?
I think you're exactly right to point out that he said this will be a monthly discussion. It gives you a sense of how the U.S. views this unfolding. This is no longer talked about in terms of days or weeks. This is talked about in terms of months. Now, part of that was planned here. They meant to have a discussion about the short term and the medium term in terms of what to provide Ukraine, the ammunition, the weaponry to stay in this fight and succeed in this fight. But part of it was always about the long term. What weapons does Ukraine need when this conflict is over, whenever that comes, to make sure it's able to defend its own sovereignty? And that focused on how to transition them from the Soviet-era weaponry that they already use to the more modern weapons that NATO countries use, not to guarantee that they would become a part of NATO, but those types of Western weapons. Some of that we're already seeing, the training on the howitzers that are already arriving in country, but it's clear now that the U.S., the UK, and some of the other countries that have already provided weapons, and others, right? There are more than 40 countries here, see this as a long-term commitment, a long-term obligation to Ukraine to make sure they have the equipment they need to provide Ukraine so they can defend themselves. On the nuclear question, not only Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin here, but we've also heard from the Pentagon in the past that they have not adjusted in any way their nuclear force posture in response to statements coming from Russia. They made it clear they see this as unhelpful rhetoric that is saber-rattling, and they simply won't go down that road. It's also worth noting that over the course of the past 2 months, which is to say since this conflict has started, the U.S. postponed and canceled a test of an intercontinental ballistic missile, while Russia went on and carried out that test regardless just a couple of weeks ago. So it gives you a sense of the care being taken by the U.S. not to needlessly escalate this. The Russians apparently don't seem bothered by that risk at all. But the shift in rhetoric is noticeable on the U.S. side, and you heard it here as well, outright stating that the goal here is for Ukraine to win and to weaken Russia, while Ukraine weakens the Russian military by attrition and by their military successes on the battlefield. It is the U.S. goal to weaken Russia's ability to rearm itself, to weaken its economy, to weaken its defense industrial base by sanctions, not only from the U.S., but from so many other countries. So some major points hit on here by the Secretary in his closing presser before he heads back to the U.S.
And importantly also is that Russia is weakened to the point that it won't threaten its neighbors anymore. Nick Robertson, you're standing by for us. We spoke earlier about the fact that the UN Secretary General Guterres is currently meeting with Putin. It's interesting that these conversations are happening concurrently. How do you think this is going to be taken by the Russians, this very strong messaging of the US standing firm against Vladimir Putin?
So specifically today, we've heard from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, saying that the US, in essence, is calling for the defeat of Russia and continues to stuff weapons into Ukraine. And the very clear message coming from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and those other nations, 40 nations gathered around him, was that there is now, as he said, this clear, shared, transparent understanding of what's happening. But I think the real message to the Russians here is that all of these partners are giving Ukraine strength today, Lloyd Austin's word, strength today, and build tomorrow. Build tomorrow tells Russia that its complaint that all these nations are stuffing Ukraine full of weapons tells Russia that these nations are going to continue to give that security support to Ukraine because they want it to be able to defend its sovereignty and repair its territorial integrity. And that means also having an impact on Russia's forces, which Lloyd Austin laid out there. There has already been an impact on their forces, on loss of materiel, on loss of men. So if for Russia, should the Kremlin have been listening across that press conference to its direct message, they would therefore have understood that this is going to be a long drawn out conflict. It's not going to be easy like it was in 2014 to overrun parts of Ukraine, and they may lose further men, they may lose further equipment, and they may even lose territory that they think right now they've gained in Ukraine. This is the beginning of the next phase, the longer phase here. The military forces are digging in on the ground, and the equipment and the supplies are going to continue to come. This is all about aligning for the future. That was alignment, getting everyone on the same page and pressing ahead to support Ukraine. Eventually, Moscow will recognize that this is something that is going to continue, whatever their rhetoric.
And Lord Austin said he wanted better coordinated efforts. In fact, Cedric Layton, you're standing by. I want to talk about the fact that Lord Austin said 50 cheetah systems given by Germany, British sending aircraft, Canada sending 8 armored vehicles. I guess the big question was, giving Ukraine superiority in the air. What do you make of some of the commitments that you heard today from this meeting?
Well, Eleni, I think they're very significant. The German part anti-tank, anti-aircraft weapon system is a very significant addition to this. This comes after a long debate in Germany about whether or not to actually arm Ukraine with substantial heavy weapons. And this kind of a weapon, plus the British anti-aircraft systems that are coming in and other systems that are coming in, will make a significant difference on the battlefield as long as they can get there quickly and can be used effectively. So this does something that the Ukrainians wanted to do in the form of giving them the capacity and the capability to shoot down more aircraft and potentially more missiles than they otherwise would be able to do. So that is a significant request that the Ukrainians have made, and it's a significant fulfillment of that request from the NATO side, which I think is critically important. I think there was one other thing, if I could, Eleni, that it makes a big difference in response to a German TV reporter's question. Secretary Austin made it very clear that he would welcome the possibility of Ukraine at some future point joining NATO. And I think that is something, of course, that the Russians wanted to avoid at all costs. It was one of the reasons, sensible reasons, that they used to invade Ukraine. And now the United States and NATO are signaling that Russia's goals are not going to be met as long as NATO fulfills its obligations to Ukraine and the alliance stands together. So I think those are very significant points right there.
Cedric Layton, thank you very much for your time. Nick Robertson and Aaron Lieberman as well for your insights. Great to have you on. We are going to a very short break. More Connect the World right after this. Stay with us. Much of the international community relentlessly pursuing a diplomatic solution in the face of Russia's ruthless war on Ukraine. The UN Secretary General is in Moscow to meet with Russia's president, and earlier today dozens of nations joined the US Defense Secretary in Germany for talks on Ukraine. Last hour, CNN spoke exclusively with the US Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, Mark Milley.
As you know, they struggled mightily with command and control, fighting at night, establishing air supremacy and air superiority. They had a real difficult time with logistical resupply and a wide variety of other challenges and issues. Most of that was caused by the bravery, the talent, the skill of the Ukrainians on the ground and fighting in accordance with the training that NATO and other allies have given them over many, many years. So war is a two-way street. There's action, reaction, counteraction. And the first part of this operation, the strategic attempt to seize Kiev in a lightning strike, the attempt to untopple the Zelensky government failed. And now what the Russians are trying to do is essentially envelop and then crush about half of the Ukrainian army down around the line of contact. The Ukrainians are set. They're ready for this fight. And our task here in NATO and in the West is to continue to support Ukraine in their fight for freedom.
Meanwhile, in Ukraine, a nighttime curfew is now in effect in Kyiv because of what authorities call Russian provocations. It comes as Russian troops have now taken control of Kherson city's council, weeks after they first occupied the city. Now, every day, healthcare workers in Ukraine put their lives at risk as they try to help the wounded. CNN's Clarissa Ward and her team followed two incredibly brave paramedics in Kharkiv as Russian shells fell all around them. And a warning, her report contains some disturbing images.
It's the beginning of a 24-hour shift for paramedics Alexandra Russko-ukrainskaya and Vladimir Wenzel. They prepare their ambulance for the carnage that Kharkiv residents confront every day. We have two tourniquets, Vladimir says. Alexandra's mother stops by the dispatch center to give her daughter a hug. This is one of the most dangerous jobs. Every moment together is precious. A loud stream of boom signals the day's work is beginning. That's incoming now, this ambulance worker tells us. Alexandra and Vladimir answer the call. Temperatura, she says, the code used when someone has been wounded by shelling. Their flak jackets on, they're ready to roll out.
So they've said that they've got reports one person at least has been injured in the shelling, and they're hearing some rockets as well, so we're going to see what's going on.
The shells hit a residential apartment building. The paramedics need to act fast. Russian forces are increasingly hitting the same target twice. It's called a double tap, a horrifying strategy to take out rescue workers as they respond. As we see for ourselves. Get in, Vladimir shouts. Faster, faster, faster. We take cover under the stairwell. Alexandra is trying to find the wounded person, but there's no signal. At that moment, another barrage goes off. We brace for the impact. Is everybody okay? Alexandra asks. Our team member, Maria Avdieva, has cut up her hands on broken glass. Vladimir treats her injuries, as Alexandra calls the dispatch again to find where the wounded are. We've got no connection. We're sitting in the entrance, she says, and they're shelling the shit out of us. The connection keeps dropping. Finally, she gets through to the person who called for the ambulance. Tell me your damn house number, she says. I repeat, 12G. I've told you 1,000 times, he replies. The man is dying. We decide to try to make a run for it.
1, 2, 3, let's go. Go. Come on, Maria. Maria, come on. Come on, Maria. Come on. Go, go. In the car, in the car. Slide over, slide over. Ambulance was hit, yeah? Yeah.
Okay, so we were just in an apartment building. They were looking for an injured man. A bunch of rounds came in and hit the next door building, so now we are getting out as fast as we can.
While we run out, Vladimir and Alexandra run back in. We find them treating the injured man on the side of the road. Their back window has been blown out by the blasts. He has shrapnel injuries and head trauma. Once they've stabilized him, they rush him to the hospital. Vladimir asks about his pain. The man has been deafened by the blast. Arriving at the hospital, they've done their part. It's up to others now to save him.
I have to say, I think you guys are like the bravest people I have ever met.
Back at base, we ask them why they continue to do this work, with all the danger it entails. It's normal. This is our work. Of course it's scary, like for everyone, Alexandra says. Today you were with us in the hottest place, in the oven, but we're still alive, thank God. You feel it's your duty or obligation, Vladimir tells us, to help the people who are still here.
And what do your parents say? What does your family say? Aren't they wanting you to stop this war?
No comments. No comments. It's very difficult.
They must be scared.
Yes, yes.
Proud, but scared.
Call all day, all night.
Every minute. We saw your mother.
Yes.
Ваша мама сегодня.
Да, приходила.
Она волнуется.
Очень волнуется.
She's worried to the point of hysteria, Alexandra tells us. She says you need to leave. You need to go to some safe place. Why are you doing this? I have only one child. Stop it.
And what do you say?
I have to do it, she says simply. And with that, they go back to cleaning their ambulance. Their shift only halfway through. Clarissa Ward, CNN, Kharkiv.
Life is becoming increasingly more difficult for Ukrainians who have stayed behind as Russian troops spread across the country. Our Sam Kiley spoke with one woman putting her life on the line, trying to convince others to leave and doing what she can to help people who say leaving isn't an option.
At 21, Maria Stern is a war veteran. She's been a volunteer on Ukraine's front lines in the Donbass for 5 years. Today, she's delivering medicine and food to villages within range of Russian artillery. A new phase in Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is underway, and it's sometimes hard to understand why people stay in frontline villages.
I'm asking people a specific question. Are you ready to hear children crying and saying, "Mom, I'm scared to die"? It gives me the creeps to hear them say that myself.
Russian forces have captured Izium a few miles to the north. Pounding nearby towns with artillery and rockets, they're slowly advancing south towards Slaviansk and the city of Kramatorsk. Russia's aim is to capture this territory. To do so, it needs to overrun this landscape. Maria is heading towards them, about 3 miles from the latest reported Russian forces and heavy shelling. She ignores air raid sirens. A family who've become friends are hanging on in their home, and she's bringing them food. On arrival, good news. they've agreed to pull out. A last run in the springtime garden for Evgenia and Alexandra, who ignore the town sirens.
My sister woke up this morning and said we had to leave, so we packed up. We didn't want to leave until the last minute, but then something made her want to, so we had to.
It's an emotional wrench, but it's a relief.
The importance of groups like Maria, part of a volunteer army right across Ukraine, here in the frontline villages, is not just humanitarian, it's political. It's about trying to hold on to as much Ukrainian government territory as is possible for as long as is possible.
The lessons from Bucha and other towns captured by Russia is that many civilians may not survive occupation. A neighbour, herself frightened and confused, still refuses to go. She's got a job at the local power plant. Joining Ukraine's millions of refugees risks a life of deeper poverty.
It's simply a genocide of the Ukrainian people. I don't know how else to explain it to you. And you just ask for what?
We're not planning to live here. This is my homeland. And my relatives are here. I cannot leave anyone here. My elderly grandmother is 80 and can hardly walk. I can't leave her, do you understand?
There's no joy in escape for grandmother Luga. Not for anyone in this family. Tens of thousands of people are staying on in their homes across this region. In a nearby church, Orthodox Easter services are dominated by prayers for peace. But the unholy ghost of war looms heavily here. Sam Kiley, CNN, in Mykolaiivka.
More Connect the World right after the short break. Stay with CNN. The United Nations expects 8.3 million refugees to flee Ukraine before the end of this war. More than 5 million have already made the decision to leave. And the UN Refugee Agency is looking for close to $2 billion to support those refugees who are in desperate need of help. I'm now joined by CNN's Erica Hill. Erica, you have met some of these refugees in Poland. Tell me about how they're being received.
What we do here across the board is that the refugees are incredibly grateful for the generosity of Poland and the generosity that's been shown by the Polish people. But what we're also hearing from those who are fleeing the war in Ukraine is that the experience can be much different if you come across that border as a Ukrainian versus a foreigner who was in Ukraine but is also looking for refuge.
After fleeing the war in Ukraine, a chance to just be a kid.
They are drawing what they feel.
She says here she's grateful.
Poland has welcomed nearly 3 million people since the war started, yet not everyone is greeted with open arms.
It's clear that we are more open for, those Slavic people, ethnic groups.
While Ukrainians arriving in Poland can stay for 18 months, work legally, and have access to health care and social services, non-Ukrainians can't. These 3 women knew they could help.
They have only 2 weeks to think about their next steps, and I can't imagine actually how to do it when you are a war refugee.
Overnight, they started a shelter for non-Ukrainian refugees run by KIK, a Catholic NGO in Poland. With space for 70 guests, they're turning people away daily.
And from the beginning, it's full.
Joel and Daniel, students from Nigeria, were studying management in Kyiv when the war broke out and were reluctant to leave.
It was fun for me, and I would rather love to go back to Ukraine. It was like that. It's a very good country.
You told me when you were looking to leave that it was harder for you because of the way you look, because of the color of your skin.
Yeah, to be honest, yes, it's a challenge.
They finally left 2 weeks ago and are now trying to figure out what's next.
We also try to support our guests in organizing their next steps. So sometimes it's a trip to other countries, but also we try to find flats or apartments, places to stay.
Volunteers, at least a dozen a day, keep the shelter running and help connect refugees to essential services. Among them, 27-year-old Khalid, an IT professional who fled Afghanistan 7 months ago.
I do anything that I can do. It's very good for me because I don't have any other job, and it's a better idea to spend time here.
This effort relies on donations, from clothing and toiletries to food and flowers. Even the space, which has now welcomed more than 500 people from 36 countries, is donated, a generous offer that runs out at the end of May. They're hoping to move before then to ensure these refugees have somewhere to go.
How long do you think your help will be needed?
We should be ready to invite new refugees till the end of the next year.
A challenge this team is determined to meet.
I have a feeling that we are really helping those people who are here. We cannot, solve our problems, but this is a small part that we can do.
So as I mentioned, that space which was donated to them, offered up to them for 3 months, Elena, they lose that at the end of May. So they're actively looking for a new space that can house this shelter for non-Ukrainian refugees. The current one has 19 rooms, can house about 70 people. They're actually hoping to double that space and be able to accommodate as many as 150. Elena?
Yeah, Erica, it's really great to have you on the ground there and telling these important stories. What is your sense in terms of how many people that are not Ukrainian are left destitute and in an absolute desperate situation?
So, it's hard. I would say it's hard to put an exact number on it. Part of it, too, is the way that numbers are recorded as people cross the border and then what happens to them as they make their way through Poland. The reality is for a lot of the folks that we talked to, and specifically the women who were running this shelter, what I've learned from them is that a lot of these folks really they need a place to sit and to rest for a few days while they try to figure out what those next steps are. So it may not be that they want to stay in Poland. They're grateful they can arrive here and have a place where they can take a couple of days to gather their thoughts and figure out what to do. Some of them do want to go to their home country. There were just an incredible number of foreign students who were studying in Ukraine when this war broke out. So a number of these folks are students. They can't go back to Ukraine. They want to figure out how to finish their studies. So one of the things that they told me is that they're actually looking at other universities in Western Europe and whether that's something they could do. So short answer is we don't have an exact number, but it's a lot.
Yeah, and it's such an important part of the story. Thank you so very much, Erica. Great to have you on the show. And just ahead, a tech big shot has been talking about free speech. Now Elon Musk is set to buy Twitter. What could that mean for one of the world's most influential social media platforms? Our live update is next. The world's richest person is set to take charge of one of the most influential social networks. Twitter says it will sell itself to Tesla CEO Elon Musk pending approval from regulators and shareholders. The roughly $44 billion deal would take Twitter private. Musk is a controversial user of the platform, spreading misleading claims about COVID-19 at one point, making offensive remarks about the transgender community as well. The billionaire says his goal is to bolster free speech on Twitter, calling it the digital town square where matters vital to the future of humanity are debated. Let's go to CNN's Rahel Solomon, who's in New York for us. Look, for that price, for that premium, I've got two questions. Why would Elon Musk want to pay so much? And it's really difficult for shareholders to say no to that kind of valuation.
In fact, the 38% premium, Eleni, yeah, and that's the question, right? What does Elon Musk perhaps see that some others don't? Unclear at this point. We'll see how it all plays out. But here's what we expect from a Twitter owned by Elon Musk, who, as you pointed out, is a controversial figure. New features, perhaps the possibility of editing your tweets. He also wants to ban spam bots. I think a lot of us could appreciate that. And also, he has to figure out how to monetize Twitter, how to make money off of Twitter. He pledged quite a bit of his own money, $21 billion, and borrowed even more from major Wall Street banks. So how to monetize Twitter and how to make good on this bet is going to be very important in terms of its success. Now, in terms of what happens next, we asked Dan Ives of Wedbush Securities what to expect, and he says if you are a Twitter user, you might want to be prepared to have to pay for it. Take a listen.
I think for Twitter, it's probably turning into a subscription platform, $2-3 a month. They'll lose significant amount of users, but probably those that would stay on that would significantly increase revenue. I think advertising is something, subscription service that could lead to other areas in terms of content. But let's just be clear. I mean, Twitter has challenges as a growth platform. That's why there's no second bidder looking at this.
And Eleni, it's a bold bet, and a lot of Wall Street wants to know now, will it pay off?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, the edit button sounds interesting. Subscription fees don't sound that fascinating to me. But look, there's a lot of scrutiny about this, and it comes with warnings from EU officials about the rules and regulations that Elon Musk will have to comply with.
Yeah, EU Commissioner Thierry Breton saying it's more of a reality check to Elon Musk and his plans to perhaps do away with some content moderation. These comments coming from the Financial Times, but take a look. Saying we welcome everyone, we are open, but on our conditions. At least we know what to tell him. Elon, there are rules. You are welcome, but these are our rules. It's not your rules which will apply here. Here's what we know. Twitter has roughly about 330 million monthly active users globally. The EU makes up about 45 million of those monthly. But those comments also saying that Twitter and Elon Musk could find themselves at the end of sanctions if they violate those rules, and Delaney possibly even one day being banned if they violate the rules.
Interesting times. Elon Musk doesn't respond very well to rules sometimes. So, Rahel, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be talking about this a lot in the next few weeks. Thank you so much. All right, and thank you so much for joining us. That was Connect the World. CNN's coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues after this short break. I'm Eleni Jakos. Take care.
Hello and a warm welcome to all of you. I'm Paula Newton live from New York, and this is One World. The UN Secretary General is in Moscow this hour to hold talks with Russia's president about the war in Ukraine. Now, Antonio Guterres says he's visiting Moscow as a messenger of peace and to try and find a diplomatic solution to this conflict. Earlier, he relayed that message to Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, but Moscow's top diplomat cast doubt on the prospect of future negotiations with Ukraine.
Looks like they're not really interested in negotiations. And those that are calling for Russia not to win and calling on others to defeat Russia and to destroy Russia, which is what they're doing by pumping Ukraine with weapons, and lots of weapons. If this continues, it doesn't look likely that the negotiations will be productive.
It is my deep conviction that the sooner we end this war, the better, for the people of Ukraine, for the people of the Russian Federation, and those far beyond.
Now, those talks in Moscow have been happening as Western allies meet in Germany, meantime, to discuss military aid for Ukraine. The U.S. Defense Secretary spoke about their goal to strengthen Kyiv and weaken Moscow.
They are, in fact, in terms of military capability, weaker than when it started. And you know, John, it'll be harder for them to replace some of this capability as they go forward because of the sanctions and the trade restrictions that have been placed on them. And so we would like to make sure, again, that they don't have the same type of capability to bully their neighbors that we saw at the outset of this conflict.
CNN's Stephen Collinson has been monitoring these events, and he joins us now from Washington with more. Good to see you and weigh in on this. You know, Secretary Austin, we've heard him for a couple days now. He says that the U.S. and its NATO allies need to move, in his words, at the speed of war. And yet Ukraine continues to argue that they're still moving too slowly on crucial military aid. Do you see any of this, and I know how closely you follow this in Washington, as a pivot point of sorts? You know, the Biden administration has been so careful about red lines, what they will do, what they won't do. Is that changing here?
I think so. It's been interesting the last few days that the U.S. has been more explicit about a broader war aim that it appears to have itself in Ukraine, and that is long-term damaging the Russian military machine, as Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, put it today, to stop its capacity to bully its neighbors in future. As you say, that's a big shift. At the beginning of the war, the U.S. was exceedingly cautious, stressing that it was only sending defensive weapons to Ukraine, trying to avoid the nightmare scenario of a direct clash with nuclear-armed Russia over this conflict. Since then, it's been slowly and now in increasing speed pushing those invisible Russian red lines. I think, you know, we're going to see a lot more arms pour into Ukraine. You've seen coordination today between the Americans and many other nations in Germany. Having said that, I think Ukraine is not going to get everything that it wants all the time. There is still this calculation about just how far the United States can push President Vladimir Putin. But we are now, I think, looking at a situation partly because of the strength of the Ukrainian opposition, where the U.S. believes this is going to go on for weeks and maybe many more months before there's any peace settlement during that decisive clash in the eastern part of Ukraine. And it's laying out longer-term goals, strategic, broader goals for diminishing Russia's power to do this in the future.
Yeah, and there's no question we've seen those Western allies united as ever. To that, we add the UN Secretary General wrapping up his trip at this hour to Russia. He's still meeting with Putin, as we understand it. Putin remains as belligerent as ever. You know, Ukrainian officials have been blunt. They're not happy he's there. They do not see where this is going. And you just heard Lavrov there take the opportunity to say, look, you guys are pumping Ukraine with weapons. To what end here? Because I think Ukrainian officials have made clear we want at least some humanitarian breakthrough, even if we don't get a ceasefire.
I think there have been a lot of questions throughout this conflict about exactly where the United Nations has been, not just in terms of trying to push for humanitarian corridors and things like that, but also in a broader diplomatic effort to try to end the war. I think what it reflects, and you remember a few weeks ago there was a very contentious hearing in the UN Security Council, which was effectively turned into a circus by the Russians who were spreading all sorts of disinformation. The United Nations can't really do very much, given the fact that Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council that can block almost all of its initiatives and statements. What is interesting, though, is I think that there is a possibility, perhaps, that Guterres, the UN Secretary General, could emerge as a broker in future between the two sides. But right now, there's no momentum, really, for any diplomacy or any peace efforts. We're in a situation where Ukraine thinks it might be winning this conflict. You've seen the United States repeatedly in the last few days say that it can win this war against Russia. And Russia clearly has not managed to accomplish enough of its goals for it to spin a victory. And that is why this battle in the East is going to be so decisive. So unfortunately, I think it means, many more weeks of war, more civilian casualties until we get to a point where either side would see an advantage in moving into a credible negotiating space. Whether the UN would have a role at that point, given the mistrust we're seeing from the Ukrainians that you pointed out, seems a little doubtful, but maybe things will move on.
Yeah, the impotence, though, of the UN at this point, even on a humanitarian level, has been a sore point with many as well. It should be. Stephen Collinson, thanks for joining us about this. We appreciate it. Now to a disturbing new accusation from the besieged city of Mariupol. The mayor says a third mass grave has been found near his city. But he's also accusing Russian troops of forcing civilians to work at these sites in exchange for food and water, and a reminder they are in desperate need of both. Meantime, Ukraine says the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk are currently under attack, heavy attack at this hour. A Luhansk official warned that Russian troops keep razing everything to the ground, including this small village. Take a look. Now lying in ruin, Ukraine forces and Russian-backed separatists blame each other for the devastation. I mean, clearly, there's hardly anything left there. Russian troops have now taken control of Kherson's city council weeks after they first occupied the city. And it comes after Moscow announced it will stage a referendum there, asking residents to approve the so-called independence of a new entity named the Kherson People's Republic. Ukraine's president called it all a sham. And Ukrainian authorities say 2 guided missiles were fired at Zaporizhzhia earlier. The state nuclear energy company reported that 2 missiles flew over the nuclear power plant near that city, and it posed really a huge risk to the world's safety, not just in that village. And to add to that, life becoming increasingly more difficult for Ukrainians as Russia's war spreads ever further across the country. CNN's Sam Kiley spoke with one woman putting her life on the line to convince reluctant residents to flee their homes.
At 21, Maria Stern is a war veteran. She's been a volunteer on Ukraine's front lines in the Donbass for 5 years. Today, she's delivering medicine and food to villages within range of Russian artillery. A new phase in Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is underway, and it's sometimes hard to understand why people stay in frontline villages.
I'm asking people a specific question. Are you ready to hear children crying and saying, "Mom, I'm scared to die"? It gives me the creeps to hear them say that myself.
Russian forces have captured Izium a few miles to the north. Pounding nearby towns with artillery and rockets, they're slowly advancing south towards Slaviansk and the city of Kramatorsk. Russia's aim is to capture this territory. To do so, it needs to overrun this landscape. Maria is heading towards them, about 3 miles from the latest reported Russian forces and heavy shelling. She ignores air raid sirens. A family who've become friends are hanging on in their home, and she's bringing them food. On arrival, good news. They've agreed to pull out. A last run in the springtime garden for Evgenia and Alexandra, who ignore the town's sirens.
My sister woke up this morning and said we had to leave, so we packed up. We didn't want to leave until the last minute, but then something made her want to, so we had to.
It's an emotional wrench, but it's a relief.
The importance of groups like Maria, part of a volunteer army right across Ukraine, here in the frontline villages, is not just humanitarian, it's political. It's about trying to hold on to as much Ukrainian government territory as is possible for as long as is possible.
The lessons from Bucha and other towns captured by Russia is that many civilians may not survive occupation. A neighbour, herself frightened and confused, still refuses to go. She's got a job at the local power plant. Joining Ukraine's millions of refugees risks a life of deeper poverty.
It's simply a genocide of the Ukrainian people. I don't know how else to explain it to you. And you just ask for what?
We're not planning to live here. This is my homeland. And my relatives are here. I cannot leave anyone here. My elderly grandmother is 80 and can hardly walk. I can't leave her, do you understand?
There's no joy in escape for grandmother Luba. Not for anyone in this family. Tens of thousands of people are staying on in their homes across this region. In a nearby church, Orthodox Easter services are dominated by prayers for peace. But the unholy ghost of war looms heavily here. Sam Kiley, CNN, in Mykolaiivka.
And CNN's Scott McLean now joins us on the ground in Ukraine. He joins us from Lviv. I mean, we saw Sam's report. I know that given what is going on in the east, these are dire moments, really, for so many people braving the airstrikes there. And now to that news that we had earlier, Scott, of that evidence of more mass graves in Mariupol. What do you know?
Yeah, just when you think that things can't get worse in Mariupol, you have headlines like this one. So Mariupol, the authorities have already claimed to have found 2 mass graves in villages east and west of the city. This most recent discovery, they say, is in a village just north of the city limit. And they say that these trenches that were dug first showed up on satellite images in late March. They have since expanded. They're some 200 meters long in total. Now, CNN is not in a position to confirm the existence of any of these mass graves, other than to know that undoubtedly the earth has been disturbed in those areas. But the most disturbing accusation that was made by the Mariupol mayor is that the local population was used to help dig those graves in exchange for the very basics, food and water. The UN Secretary General today offered his support in trying to broker any kind of deal or work on the ground to try to ensure safe passage for people trying to get out of Mariupol, including those people who are sheltering in that sprawling steel plant. But what's been hampering some of these negotiations to get these corridors has been the threat that Russia will push people into its own territory rather than allowing them to evacuate to Ukraine. Just last week, a group of people from Mariupol showed up in Siberia. That is bringing back painful memories of a dark chapter in Soviet history where people by the millions were taken from their homes and relocated to very remote parts of the Soviet Union. And I spoke to one Estonian man who says he sees plenty of parallels with the situation in Ukraine today.
These photos were shot in the Siberian city of Nakhodka, just a stone's throw from North Korea. Local Russian media reported that more than 300 Mariupol residents arrived here by train. The Ukrainian Human Rights Commissioner says the new arrivals were forcibly deported from Ukraine and taken to Siberia, a violation of the Geneva Convention. The story appears to fit a growing pattern, Mariupol's most desperate people being pushed into Russian territory. The American ambassador to the UN has raised concerns about the apparent forced removals, a tactic that is well worn in Soviet history.
Your mother worked in the coal mine.
Yeah.
Enno Weibo is 76 today, but he was only 3 when soldiers showed up at his family home in southern Estonia, then part of the Soviet Union, to take his family away.
We saw cars very, very rarely. Never been in the car before. But this time we got to ride a car.
You couldn't understand why everyone was upset because you were excited to be able to ride in a car.
For me, it was not understandable. My family used to be very cheerful. I couldn't understand why my brother was not making jokes, Sister was not laughing, mom had tears in her eyes, and father was very gloomy.
In the dead of winter, that pickup truck took them to the train station where they were loaded with others into a packed cattle car and taken on a journey that took 18 days. Some people didn't survive the trip. His family was among the millions of people who, under Joseph Stalin, were forcibly taken from their homes and sent to remote parts of the Soviet Union. Political dissidents, rebels, or farmers who opposed the communist takeover of their land were all marked for deportation, all in an effort to crush any dissent. In Siberia, Weibo's family lived in the barracks of an old prisoner of war camp. It was almost a decade before they were finally allowed to return to their home, which by then had been destroyed. The names of the more than 22,000 Estonians who were killed or died in the brutal conditions are inscribed on this memorial. Weibo's older brother, who took up arms for independence, is one of them. Historian Milas Maripuu also has family on the wall.
It was a possibility to actually to kill the people without to doing nothing. The people just died through diseases, through starvation.
It made people realize that they should just sort of bow down and accept the system as it is.
Yes, so after such repressions, the people should accept the system as it is.
What has been the lasting impact of this experience on your life?
I lost my childhood. I had to remain myself in a foreign and hostile environment.
Do you see any parallels with what's happening today?
I was sure that nothing like this could ever happen again. But what has happened in Ukraine has brought these painful memories back very vividly. It's unbelievable that time hasn't changed anything at all. Evil has become even worse. With my whole soul, I feel for Ukrainians who are taken violently, against their will, from their homes to the unknown.
Now, the threat of people being pushed into Russia is one of the reasons why the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister said yesterday that she would not accept Russia's proposal to have a ceasefire to evacuate people, because she said that the Russians simply cannot be trusted to keep their word, Paula.
Yeah, Scott, I want to thank you for that report. It has been utterly depressing, especially to see the elderly people there in Ukraine, some of whom have already gone through this once, and then expressing their torment. And a reminder, some of those elderly people are in Mariupol at this hour, undergoing still, just absolutely inhumane conditions. Scott McLean for us in Lviv, thank you again. Now, as the war in Ukraine rages on, I'll speak with a U.S. congressman about the type of support Kyiv will need to fend off Russia. Western allies have been meeting today to discuss more support for Ukraine. Earlier, U.S. General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told CNN that America and its partners would not only supply lethal and non-lethal aid to Kyiv, but would also try to weaken Russia. Listen.
At the end of the day, what we want to see, what I think the policy of all of our governments together, is a free and independent Ukraine with their territory intact and their government standing, and the Russian aggression has been halted and stopped. And at the end of the day, I think that's going to involve a weakened Russia, a strengthened NATO, and as you see, Finland and Sweden and other countries, and the unity of the West and the unity of NATO, and indeed the unity of the globe has probably never been stronger than it is in the face of this unprovoked aggression.
To get more on this, we're now joined by U.S. Representative John Garamendi. He's a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and a powerful committee indeed, especially when we're talking about arming Ukraine and how that's changed, right? Now, we heard from Foreign Minister Lavrov saying that this is now truly, in his estimation, a proxy war from NATO, and worse, that there is a threat of nuclear conflict, and that risk is real. Does this make the U.S. more willing to provide that capability to Ukraine, capability that just a few weeks ago, the president said would be going too far?
Well, certainly the situation in Ukraine radically changed. The United States did provide the weapons that the Ukrainian military needed to stop the #1 goal of Russia, which was to take over Kyiv. That did not happen. The Ukrainians defeated. We provided weapons, but the Ukrainians provided the courage, the support, and the determination to win the Battle of Kyiv. Now we've moved to a different phase in which we're looking at the Russian military doing what it's probably best at, and that is tank battles on the plains of eastern Ukraine. And that requires the United States to change, and NATO, to change the kind of weapons that we have previously been supplying, and that is heavy weapons, tanks, heavy artillery, long-range artillery, and the rest. All of that is coming. With regard to what this is all about a free and independent Ukraine. The inevitable result of that effort by Russia to subjugate Ukraine is a very strong NATO alliance, an alliance that was asleep 6 months ago, but now an alliance that is roaring and determined to not allow Russia to carry on its efforts to take over Ukraine.
But does it bother you when you hear Sergei Lavrov say that, look, this is just going to escalate things further, or do you think that's just rhetoric on the part of Russia? I mean, to say, again, that this risks nuclear conflict, serious?
Well, Russia has had a clear nuclear doctrine, and that is that they would escalate, that is, go nuclear, to de-escalate. It was always, at least heretofore, in the context of the country of Russia being at risk, or the leadership of Russia being at risk. At the moment, that is simply not the case. NATO has absolutely no intention, nor does the United States military have any authority whatsoever to invade Russia. That's not it. We do have, and we are clearly underway, providing the armaments and training and other support that Ukraine needs to protect itself. And that's exactly what is happening. We are not about to invade Russia, and therefore the nuclear doctrine that was explicit, at least before this war began, will not be effective. That is, we're not going to be invading Russia.
And yet we have seen Russia twist certainly things to really meet its own strategic goals before. I want to get to what Secretary Austin said, just the other day. He's repeated it again today, that the U.S. and its allies aim to weaken Russia's military capability. I'm sure you're on board with that. But what can Congress do, your committee, materially, to make that happen? What weapons are you considering now, today, that were not considered a couple months ago?
Well, certainly some of which we've already talked about. We're talking about providing additional airplanes and various parts and pieces to keep the existing Ukrainian Air Force up and operating. Those planes will come from other countries. Some of that is already underway. perhaps even more important, are the air defense systems that are being supplied by NATO countries. Some of them, the short-range missiles that have been deployed already are in place in Ukraine. In addition to that, we're clearly, United States and NATO countries are providing long-range cannon systems, as well as what we call counter-battery systems that are able to, using various radar technology, identify where incoming cannon fire is coming from and then counter that with our own, or in this case, with Ukraine's batteries. All of that is in place. Also, the NATO countries on the eastern side are providing tanks, actually Russian tanks that are in the inventory of those countries.
When we get to the air defense systems and the capability in the air, for weeks, so he's dropped it now. President Zelensky said he wanted a no fly zone. Do you believe, from what you see on paper, that if all of this gets to Ukraine in the next few weeks, that they will be able to impose their own no fly zone of sorts to a certain extent?
Well, you used the right word, to a certain extent. Aerial battles between fighter jets of Ukraine and Russia have taken place. Unfortunately for Ukraine, the fighter jets that Ukraine has and the other NATO countries, Russian-made, are the older version. So it's not exactly a fair fight. However, by all accounts, the Ukraine pilots using these older versions of the Russian fighter jets have been successful in eliminating Russians' most advanced fighters. In addition to that, I don't have the exact numbers, but apparently Ukraine has been successful in using the Stinger missiles that we have provided for the low-flying aircraft, basically forcing the Russian aerial bombers and aircraft to stay very much high in altitude. When they get down lower, those Stingers are very successful, certainly against helicopters and other low-flying aircraft. The Russian mid-level aerial defense systems from the NATO countries, the eastern NATO countries, are now employed. So Russia is actually at risk with its own air defense systems that have been purchased and obtained by Poland and the other East European NATO countries. And that's got to be a real problem for Russia. Those S-300 are very useful and have been very successfully deployed. So is there a no-fly zone? No, but is there a very high-risk fly zone for Russia? Absolutely.
Yeah, a very salient point that you make right there. I don't have a lot of time left, but very quickly, a lot of bipartisan support so far. In terms of the nitty-gritty on your committee, I'm going to ballpark at about $16 billion spent so far. Do you see any limits to this? At what point you guys say we just can't spend much more?
The military budget for the Department of Defense, United States, is over $800 billion when all factors are included. Can we find money to do this? Absolutely. Should we find money to do this? Absolutely. Must we find money to support the Ukrainians? Absolutely. We will find it. We will make sure that it's available. And right now, the administration, the Department of Defense, and others are doing everything necessary to get the heavy equipment there in a timely way.
Okay, Congressman, we have to leave it there. We hear the resolve in your voice, and we'll continue to watch developments on the ground. Appreciate it.
Count on it.
And some breaking news just into CNN. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris has tested positive for COVID-19. Now, we do not have any further information on how she's feeling at this point. The White House says she does not have any symptoms. It's clearly a good sign, but we will bring you more news on that as soon as we have it. And stay with us. We will be right back with more news in a moment. Hello and welcome back. I'm Paula Newton with some breaking news just into CNN. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris has tested positive for COVID-19. Now, the White House says she doesn't have any symptoms, which is good news, and will isolate and work from home. The White House also says Harris, in fact, has not had any recent contact with President Biden due to their travel schedules. We will have much more news on this when it comes in. But as for now, the Vice President testing positive, but is feeling fine and will work from home. And now we want to catch you up on some more news headlines we're following. Beijing is scrambling to contain its latest COVID-19 outbreak and avoid the kind of spread that triggered Shanghai's extreme citywide lockdown. Dozens of communities right across 8 districts in Beijing now under strict lockdown, though, while health officials are mass testing millions of people all week. North Korea's leader says his country will strengthen its nuclear force at what he called the highest possible speed. According to state media, Kim Jong-un made the pledge during a military parade where some of Pyongyang's most powerful weapons were on display. South Korea says it is monitoring the situation and called on the North to end activities that could fuel tensions. The World Health Organization says a new outbreak of Ebola has now claimed a second life in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, the 25-year-old woman who died was the sister-in-law of the first Ebola victim. Health officials are hoping to contain the new outbreak, which was declared just 3 days ago. Elon Musk could be in charge of Twitter before the year is done. Industry analysts think he won't have problems with regulators approving his $44 billion buyout because Musk does not own any other media properties. But it could take time for Musk to win over Twitter employees. That's another thing. Twitter CEO held a company-wide meeting Monday to answer questions about the buyout. Many employees seem skeptical. And some asked if Musk's commitment to free speech would allow Donald Trump back on the platform. And while Musk claims to be a champion of free speech, some say he's more of an internet troll. Let's take you through this, okay? For example, just days ago, he mocked Bill Gates's weight in a post we actually can't show. It's not appropriate to show you that on TV. That's part of a larger pattern of behavior as he seems to take joy in squabbling with politicians and, of course, causing a stir in the meantime. Musk was vocal about the U.S. response to the COVID pandemic. In 2020, he tweeted, quote, "The coronavirus pandemic is dumb." And he said doctors were overinflating the death toll. I'll remind you, it's close to 1 million now in the United States and counting. Also in 2020, he said on Twitter that in his opinion, Tesla stock was too high. Angry shareholders replied to that tweet, including one who said he lost $10,000 because of that opinion he decided to broadcast. Now, a few years earlier, he also caused market turmoil for Tesla when he tweeted, "I'm considering taking Tesla private at $420, funding secured." The SEC called the apparent marijuana joke irresponsible. And this is the thing, Musk paid millions for that in fines. Also in 2018, Musk was slapped with a defamation lawsuit when 12 boys and their football coach were trapped in a flooded cave in Thailand. Musk tweeted about a volunteer who was part of the rescue team. Musk called him irresponsibly, of course, pedo guy, and later deleted the tweet and apologized. The man sued, but a federal jury sided with Musk. As always, free speech does not mean free of consequences for the community, for yourself, or of course for others. We want to dive into this a little deeper into what Elon Musk wants to do with Twitter. Joining me now is Mike Isaac, the New York Times technology correspondent, who has the privilege of covering this inside and out, this entire soap opera. 2 quick questions that are easy to pose, hard to figure out. How will Musk change Twitter, not just for his business, but for users as well?
I was just thinking how it's been a while since I've heard all of his indiscretions laid out like that. So I appreciate that reminder. It's crazy. I think that's exactly what folks are trying to figure out right now. You know, we were listening in on that employee call yesterday, and the employees basically asked Twitter CEO Parag Agrawal, you know, how is he going to change his company? What are the sort of product changes? Elon has hinted at a few things he wants to change around, you know, advertising for their subscription service, or eliminating spam bots, or just sort of like kind of, you know, incremental product changes. But I think folks are really worried, what are the big sweeping changes he has in mind? And there were no real good answers. It seems like management doesn't even know at this point. They were honestly what we gleaned was that the conversations have not been super in depth on the long-term vision. So it's anyone's guess, at least as for big changes.
Yeah, I mean, and the board, as I'm sure you'll agree, had no choice, right? They had a fiduciary responsibility to take this, It was a good price. It was a high price. And now we're all left to deal with the consequences. Now, when it comes to freedom of speech, it's a brawl. It is a bit out of control at the moment, especially when it comes to hate speech. That's just one issue that we're dealing with here. I mean, do you think he will take this on board in a serious way? Because you and I both know if he doesn't, regulators in different countries around the world will step in.
No, 100%. I think your point earlier was right. Freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences, and Musk should know that better than anyone. But I think his views on speech online, some folks have called pretty sophomoric. His idea that he floated in an interview at TED last week was basically he wants anything to go short of it being a crime. But what constitutes a crime changes from country to country. It's not as simple as this is what happens in America, so this is what happens in the rest of the world. In Germany, for example, Nazism online is illegal. You can't actually tweet in support of Nazism. So, is that going to apply in his sort of version of Twitter, or does he want to sort of eliminate everything? So, I think he's got a really rudimentary understanding of what he at least wants right now, and is probably in for a rude awakening when the policy people at Twitter tell him how to make all this work.
Yeah, and I think, to be blunt, I think most of us could care less if Elon Musk makes money off of this just because, he is the richest man in the world. Clearly, he can afford it. That's not the point. But look at here in the United States. We've got midterms approaching. Okay, this is just the United States. Musk continues to write that, as you say, quite naively, free speech is the bedrock of a functioning democracy, he says. Twitter is the digital town square. Okay, so far, so normal. And yet, how do you think he's actually going to navigate this? Because it does matter. I mean, even when we talk about questions about whether or not he's going to allow former President Donald Trump back on the platform.
Yeah, well, I was thinking as I was talking about this before, but I think part of his very blunt way of taking this on is probably a feature, not a bug. There's a lot of people generally right-leaning or right conservative / libertarian Silicon Valley views who don't care about the consequences and kind of want to remove a lot of these strictures and think, look, harassment, brigading online and sort of trolling is just part of the discourse,
And Mike, I will just have to leave it there because we have breaking news on Ukraine, but thanks so much for your insights to the story.
Sure.
We'll continue to follow. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Paula.
Now, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres met with Russian President Vladimir Putin. We want to listen in. This happened just moments ago.
Уважаемый господин генеральный секретарь.
Dear Mr. Secretary General.
Уважаемый господин генеральный секретарь, я очень рад вас видеть.
Dear Mr. Secretary General, it's my pleasure to see you.
Перевод идет, все
Good
нормально?
afternoon. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, Mr. President.
Are you getting translation?
Уважаемый господин генеральный секретарь, очень рад вас видеть.
It is my
Россия,
pleasure to see
как
you. And
одна
Russia
из стран основоположников
one of the
Организации Объединенных Наций
founding countries of the United Nations and the permanent member in the Security Council, we believe that this organization is not just universal, but actually unique. In a way, there is no any other organization like this in the international community, and surely we support the principles on which it is based. And it is quite strange for us when we hear certain, when they speak about the peace founded on rules, and we know that the main rule is the United Nations rule, and all the other documents or some other papers written by someone for themselves, they're only written for their own interest. And we are quite surprised to hear some claims from our colleagues saying that somebody may claim some exclusive right because the UN Charter clearly says that all members of the international community are equal, irrespective of their size and potential and their geographical location. And I believe that it's just what's written in the Bible, you know, that all people are equal. I'm sure the same is in Quran or Torah. Everybody is equal and the same before God. So that's why this idea is that somebody can claim and for some exclusivity. This is strange, but this is, you know, it's a complicated world, so it is what it is. And surely United Nations has experienced various seasons of its history. Even recently we heard that the organization is obsolete, and we know that it was happening at the moment when the organization was on the way of somebody to achieve their goals, whereas we always believed that we have to treasure and value such an organizations as United Nations. And surely I know about your concerns about the special military operation in Donbass and Ukraine, and I believe surely this will be the basis of our talks today. And in that regard, I also would like to note that the entire problem has actually happened as the result of the overturn of the coup that happened in 2014. Surely it was a constitutional change, a constitutional coup d'etat. And then we obviously started receiving requests from the Crimea and the east of Ukraine, just similar to what it was like in Kosovo in some point, because they made the decision to leave, to become independent and to join Russia. We know in Kosovo it was different. It was adopted by the parliament. In Sevastopol or the Crimea, it all happened by the referendum. And the same happened in the east of Ukraine, where there are two units, territorial units, which did not agree with the results of the coup d'etat, and yet they had to suffer the impact, the governmental impact, and which also included some military pressure as well. And this is how the crisis developed in the east, in Donbass and the southeast of Ukraine. And as it is known, after the next unfortunate attempt by the Ukrainian government to resolve the matter peacefully, we tried to peacefully regulate this, resolve the situation with the help of the Minsk Treaty, but unfortunately, over the period of these 8 years, those people have always been in blockade, and the Kiev government has been continuously saying that it was a blockade, although at first they would not admit, and then they continued these combat actions. And then once the Kiev government, and I'm emphasizing publicly, said that they are not intending to fulfill Minsk Treaty, we decided to stop the genocide in those territories and recognize them as parts of the Russian Federation. And I would like to emphasize those we were forced We were forced to do this, and unfortunately foreign colleagues did not recognize this. And then later on, we were asked by these territorial units, they did ask for our help, our military help, and with in accordance with the UN relevant UN regulations. That's what we did. We started the special military operation, and despite the fact that the special military operation is underway, we do count that we are still open for negotiations. We do not reject them. Moreover, in Istanbul, I know you've been there, and I just spoke to President Erdogan today. We did manage to the requirements of the international security. We see that our Ukrainian colleagues are not associating it with the recognizing the borders, for example, when we're talking about the Crimea or the recognized Donbas units. Unfortunately, after our negotiations and after our clear intentions to create a conducive atmosphere for negotiations, we were faced with the provocation in Bucha. And we know who had done that. We know who did that provocation. We know what persons and how they had been working on this. So our position with the further peaceful regulations certainly had to be adjusted, because we see that they are not willing to commit to the security guarantees, and that's why we are talking about they themselves that they refused. And in their draft, in 2 articles, they clearly showed that these issues have to be resolved during the meeting of 2 leaders of the countries. And for us, this is clear that if we have not been able to resolve something preliminary as a draft, then that means this is just never going to be resolved. And so it's impossible to assign any security guarantees if we don't have these issues with regard to Crimea, to the Crimea and east of Ukraine and Donbas. And yet the negotiations are still underway, and I do hope that somehow we reach some positive result. This is what I wanted to say in the beginning, and I'm sure you probably will have other questions in this regard as well as on other topics, and it's my pleasure to see you.
Благодарю вас, господин президент. Благодарю вас за то, что принимаете меня в Кремле. В самом деле, будучи генеральным секретарем, моя главная озабоченность — это ситуация на Украине. И у меня есть четкое понимание того, что нам нужен многосторонний порядок, основанный на Уставе Организации Объединенных Наций и на международном праве. Любые правила, которые будут устанавливаться, должны устанавливаться при консенсусе международного сообщества и полностью соответствуют. Галии ответственен за отношения между ЕС и Россией. Возможно, вот даже в той же комнате мы встречались. Я понимаю ваше недовольство, которое у вас есть, но с нашей точки зрения эти недовольства необходимо разрешать, основываясь на разных инструментах, предложенных Уставом ООН. Мы твердо верим, что нарушение территориальной целостности любой страны полностью не соответствует Уставу ООН. И мы глубоко озабочены в связи с
All
тем,
right, you
что
have been listening to a meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin, and you see him there, Secretary General Antonio Guterres from the United Nations. We want to bring in our Nick Robertson, who's also been following in on this discussion. We will, of course, bring you back into this as soon as we can get some English translation for the Secretary General there. And Nick, good to have you on board. I mean, a few things there. Putin at first saying that, in fact, he's still open to negotiations. But then obviously bringing up the ridiculous point that he says that Bucha, again, repeating that Bucha was a provocation, alleging that they know who's responsible of this, really repeating the sentiment that they say Ukrainians are responsible for the atrocities there. Nick, the spectacle is not a good one, right? We've got this long table, again, Putin on one side, Guterres on the other. We'll wait to see what Guterres' comments are. But again, this is all a fairly good propaganda piece for Vladimir Putin on Russian state TV right now.
That's exactly what I was thinking, Paula. It really is. I mean, what we're getting is the pure, unadulterated version of the propaganda that the Russian people are getting, which is Putin's criticism of, you know, the United States at the United Nations, criticizing the United Nations, saying it was supposed to be fair, all countries are supposed to be treated equally under the Charter, but some really aren't. You know, his foreign minister earlier today was accusing the United States of going behind the backs of some of the diplomats at the UN and making them vote the way the United States wants to by threatening to close down bank accounts and threatening to take their children out of school. Unfounded allegations, of course, but you know, Putin's giving us another version of that, giving the Russian people another version of that. The world is all stacked up against Russia. I mean, that's the allegation there. And then, of course, he got into his whole justification of why Russia's having this war in Ukraine. It's not our fault. We're going in there to stop a genocide. Again, another unfounded allegation. We had to go in to support the people because in Donbass and Crimea because there was a coup d'etat in Kyiv. Of course, you know, this is not factually correct at all. And what he glosses over, doesn't even mention, is the fact that Russia illegally annexed, put its troops into Crimea and illegally annexed it, and did the same, illegally put their troops into Donbass region and has denied it ever since. The world has seen very clearly. But here you have Russia, President Putin sitting down with the world's top diplomat who speaks to all the nations at the United Nations, tries to represent them all as best he can, understands what's going on. And here's Putin in front of him in complete and utter denial of what is being told by the UN Secretary General. The war crimes, as you say, in Bucha. No, says President Putin, that's all the Ukrainians' fault. So I mean, it would be too much to expect that Putin would actually come out on national TV and do anything other than propagandize Russia's position as he has done, and his officials do day by day by day by day since the war began over 2 months ago. It would be too much to expect that. But I think it's probably unrealistic to expect that it was wholly different behind closed doors. Of course, it would be interesting to hear what Antonio Guterres is saying. I'm sure the translations and the audio feeds coming from the Kremlin, they're obviously controlling the output here, can get this fixed and will eventually be able to hear what the UN Secretary General is saying. But it's hard to imagine that this has been anything less than competing views about what's really going on.
Yeah, Nick, we've only got about 30 seconds left here, but you put a very fine point on it. There really will not be anything behind closed doors because the Secretary General wants to come home with something, even if it's just humanitarian guarantees for things like, you know, the catastrophe in Mariupol.
That's what he put at the top of his agenda, offering, when he was meeting with Sergei Lavrov, offering to have the UN represented there, the Red Cross represented there, the Russians could be there, the Ukrainians could be there. They could work together to help the poor beleaguered civilians that are there and also get the Ukrainian forces out. It's not in Russia's strategic interest. Putin has said, build a wall around it, don't let a gnat in. They don't want any international footprint there because they're afraid, Russia is afraid that that would turn into a way of holding that territory for Ukraine. And they don't want that at all. Completely opposed to it. So, again, Nick, hard to see meeting of the minds.
Absolutely. Nick Robertson for us, live in Brussels. Appreciate your input here. And I want to thank everyone for watching One World. I'm Paula Newton. Amanpour is next.